true that some of you... Now I'm turned on. It's true that some of you may not have been here last night, so I'm just going to go by way of quick reintroduction. Okay, my name is Jim Wallace. I work in Los Angeles County. I work cold case homicides. These are all cases that are unsolved murders. There's no statute of limitations on a murder. So I have cases that range from about 1972 to about 1990, in that range. I started off working just homicide cases and eventually discovered that I could open and work as a collateral duty all of our unsolveds. And so some of these unsolveds we had were my dad's old cases. And I thought, I could solve my dad's old cases just so I can put my thumb in his eye and say, hey, you couldn't solve these, but I did. So a lot of these were his cases that I reopened and had some success doing that and learned a lot along the way. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take time to talk to you about what processes you might use as a detective to determine if Christianity is true. We started that last night. We started out building a foundation for truth and then talked about, well, if there's no truth about God. If there's no God, there's no Christian God. So we wanted to take the time to make a case for that. And that's what we tried to do last night. I have a family that still serves in law enforcement. My son has been there for 8 years. We've been at the same agency since 1961. We're going to talk about techniques that we've been using since 1961 to 2019. But why are we doing this at all? Why are we doing this at all here at this church? Look, most of you know that as church leaders, sometimes we get frustrated because it feels like what we're doing are Sunday performances, right? Where we're actually... It's almost like going to see a Christian film. I was in God's Not Dead 2, and people would go to that film and they would say it was always great, I enjoyed it, then they go off and live their lives. Nothing's changed on the backside of watching God's Not Dead 2. Is that what we're doing at church too? We kind of come to church, we sit for an hour, we do worship, we listen to a sermon, and we go out in our lives and nothing really changes. Well, there are a number of churches that actually understand this difference and have said, you know what, we're not only going to be a church that learns in the pews, we're going to be a church that does something in the community. And that's why I was so happy to come to you guys, because I saw what you're doing online. I could see that this is something that you're planning ahead for. So I just hope that you will sign up, you will take advantage of the Serve Day that's coming here. And I say that genuinely, because you're a church right now that's had an entire calendar year talking about this. Like 5 people you're supposed to be praying about and think, well, look, the stuff that we're talking about in this session today is the stuff that you can actually share with your friends and family members who are not yet Christians. Or maybe the young people in your lives who are starting to struggle and ask, is this even true? Well, that's what I hope you'll do with this information. I hope whatever we're doing as a family in this community, that what we're doing today will feed that process. That's why we're doing this, not to entertain you. And by the way, it's going to feel like we're drinking water out of a fire hose. You probably already feel that way. So I get it. I'm going to send you all the videos. Yes, I brought books. I've got this, what we're talking about today, it comes from Cold Case Christianity. We also have kids' books of every category. But I say this all the time, and I mean it honestly. As an atheist, the thing I suspected about Christians, and I didn't become a Christian until I was 35, was that you guys are always trying to sell us something. And so now, because God's got a sense of humor, years later, I am the Christian who's got a book to sell. So I don't like it. But I do know that some of the stuff we're talking about, to deep dive in it, you almost need to read a book to do it. Now, I want to talk about what the similarities are between working cold case investigations and examining the Christian worldview. Remember, cold cases are an historical event that occurred in the distant past. I typically have no living eyewitnesses who can tell me who did it. That's why it's cold to begin with. If we had eyewitnesses back in the day, we would have solved it back then. We didn't solve it because it was a lame case from the get-go. Also, I don't have any forensic evidence that'll solve the case. If I did, I would have solved it back then. I don't have DNA cases. I only have one I ever solved with DNA. I wanted to solve all of them with DNA, but it didn't work out that way. Instead, what we do is we build convincing circumstantial cases. Now, I know when I use that expression, you're all thinking, well, that's the junk evidence, right? Because you've heard this on TV. All they have is a circumstantial case. Well, it's purely circumstantial. How many times do you hear that? It's not meant to be a compliment. It's meant in a pejorative, right? Like, hey, this is not good evidence. It's just circumstantial evidence. Well, I want to dispel you of that to begin with, because that is a mistaken idea. But this is the nature of cold cases. It just so happens this is also the nature of the Christian worldview. We've got an event in the distant past for which I have no living eyewitnesses. I can't use forensic evidence to make the case. Instead, we have to look at this as a cumulative circumstantial case. Does that make sense? The exact same skill set. Like, I got cases where the witness is no longer available to me. He's dead. The detective who wrote the report when he first interviewed the witness is also dead. So now I have a report in which I have no access to the report writer or to the witness. What does that sound like to you? Those are the Gospels. So how do you determine if any of that stuff is true? That's exactly the same process we use in cold cases. We're going to do that this morning together. All right, we're going to start by showing you what this word is all about, this word circumstantial. Why is this reliable? Why is this something we can use to make a case? So let's do a case together. This young man has been accused of killing his girlfriend with a baseball bat. He bludgeoned her to death. Now, how do we make a case like this? You only have two ways you can make a case like this. You can make a case with the two forms of evidence that are available to us, and there are only two forms of evidence. People say, hey, do you have any hard evidence? There's no such thing as hard evidence. That's not a category. We have two categories: direct evidence and indirect evidence. That's it. Those are the only two categories of evidence. The only thing that qualifies as direct evidence is an eyewitness account. Somebody who saw the crime occur and can identify my suspect. That is direct evidence. Everything else is called indirect evidence. DNA, indirect. Fingerprints, indirect. Material evidences, indirect. Behaviors, indirect. Everything else is indirect if it's not an eyewitness. Indirect evidence is also called circumstantial evidence. So it turns out if you're going to work a case with circumstantial evidence, that's everything. Everything except for eyewitnesses. My cases are 100% circumstantial. Now, if I'm going to make this case directly, I have to have an eyewitness. Somebody who saw this, maybe from across the street. Somebody who says, yeah, I live across the street from these people. This lady's always arguing with their boyfriend, and that day I looked up and through the plate glass window, they were arguing, and then I saw him punch her square in the face. And then when she hit the ground, he got a baseball bat. He just beat her without any regard, and then he ran out to his car and drove away. You saw that? Yeah, I saw it. Well, do you happen to know who that guy is? Oh, I know him very well. Oh, you know the suspect? Oh, yeah. These guys have been dating forever. Okay, I know these kids. They grew up in this neighborhood. We're a very close neighborhood. We do block parties together. We celebrate holidays together. As a matter of fact, on the day of the murder, this guy was wearing the shirt that I gave him for Christmas 2 years ago. Okay, that's a good witness. If that witness holds up under cross-examination, you can make this entire case with one piece of evidence, the direct testimony of this eyewitness. This is what direct evidence cases look like. Let's change it, though. What if on the day of the murder he's not wearing the shirt that she gave him for Christmas? And in fact, he's got a mask over his face. Let's do that. Well, now she cannot identify him directly. She can say, well, he looks kind of like the same height and weight as the boyfriend that I know, but I don't know if it was a boyfriend because he had his face covered. Are you willing to convict him on that? I don't think many of us would, right? So now we can't make this case directly. We have to make it indirectly, using indirect evidence. Well, what does that look like? Let's go knock on his door. What were you doing yesterday, the day of the murder? What were you doing about the time of the murder occurred? Oh, I was out drinking with two of my friends. Oh, really? What are their names? We go interview those two guys. He's lying to us. They have not seen him in weeks. So now he's lying about his alibi, and he fits the general description. How many of you think he's guilty right now? Raise your hand. Let me see how many we have. A few, right? Okay. Because why would you lie about your alibi? Not only that, when we do a search warrant at his house, he's got a baseball bat. Well, a lot of people have baseball bats, but his baseball bat's different. On the thick part of the bat, it's all nicked and dinged up, like he's been using it to hit something other than baseballs. Not only that, when we examine it for biological evidence, it's clean because we can see it's been soaked in bleach. Now, why would anybody soak their baseball bat in bleach? Bleached bat, BO alibi, fits the general description. How many of you think he's guilty now? Raise your hand if he's guilty. A few more. Still have some holdouts, though. In California, nobody raises their hand, okay? I'm just going to tell you right now. In Texas, he's already on death row, okay? There's your spectrum, okay, between states. Not only does he have a baseball bat, but in his closet, he's got a pair of blue jeans. And these blue jeans are dirty but they are clean at the thigh, and luminol is a chemical we use to identify either body fluids or blood. Also, it'll identify certain detergents. And sure enough, it's glowing at the thigh, and it's clean at the thigh. So he spot cleans something successfully at the thigh. But why are you spot cleaning anything when the entire pair of pants is dirty? Just throw them in the wash. No, he's not interested in the dirt. He's interested in something else that's on the thigh of his pants. What could that be? Spot clean pants, bleached back, BO alibi, fits the general description. And there's no sign of forced entry at the house. No one broke a door or a window to get in. That means whoever got in was either voluntarily let in or had a key to get in. Only 3 people have a key to the house. The girlfriend's got a key, her mom had a key, she died about 2 months earlier, and our crazy boyfriend's got a key. And in the interview, he'll admit that he's a crazy boyfriend. He'll say that, yeah, I got a bad temper. And I have punched her on occasion, but I don't mean anything by it. I lose my temper. And she understands who I am. She always forgives me. She always takes me back. On the day of the murder, yeah, I punched her. I even threatened her. I told her. But you know why? Because I found out on that day that she was cheating on me. Who would cheat on this guy? Right? I'd be afraid to cheat on that guy. Now, how many of you right now think he is our guy? Raise your hand. Still got some holdouts. These are all the people who came over here from California and now living in the state of Tennessee. On the day of the murder, the witness says he ran out of the house and he had a very unusual boot, a work boot that had a piece of leather on the side, a vertical piece of leather on the outside of the boot. You do some research on that. It's a very unusual boot. Only one manufacturer makes a boot like that. They only sell at one store anywhere in the county. They've only sold about 30 pairs in the last 2 years. So who do you think, though, has got one of those pairs in his house? Our guy. Now, why is this important? Because it's kind of like a statistical game. He's got a 1 in 30 relationship to these boots. He's got a 1 in 3 relationship to the key. What are the odds that one of these 3 is also one of these 30? Do you see the problem? How many of you think he's guilty now? Raise your hand. Still got holdouts. What is the deal? You know, if you'd have gotten to this search warrant a few minutes late, he'd have been dead because he was getting ready to kill himself. We know that because on the counter is a partially completed suicide note. And in that suicide note, he says he did something yesterday, which happens to be the day of the murder, that is so horrific he cannot forgive himself. He has changed the course of his family, of his own life. He can't take it back, and he cannot live with what he's done. But because you got there too early, he wasn't able to finish that statement. So there's nowhere in there to say that the thing he feels bad about is killing his girlfriend. Also, the witness says when he drove away, he was in a very unusual car, like an early 70s yellow-colored Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. Do you guys even know what that is? Okay, raise your hand if you know what that is. Raise your hand. Okay, everyone look at the people. These are the old people in the room, okay? Because their Karmann Ghia hasn't been on the road in years, and even in our state, which is pretty dry, there's like a few functional Karmann Ghias that are still registered in Department of Motor Vehicles. They don't tell you what color they are. There's like 3 in the entire county. But sure enough, when you open the garage door on this guy's house, what do you think he's got in his garage? He's got himself a yellow 1972 Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. Now, at this point, we could ask the question, is it possible he's innocent? Yeah, of course. But I said like last night, we're not interested in possible. We're interested in reasonable. Is it reasonable that he's innocent? Now, what defense attorneys will do is they'll say, you know, that first piece of evidence, I can explain that a different way. And I can explain this one with some explanation over here. And this one over here, some other explanation over there. And it's just he's so unlucky. There happen to be 8 unrelated causes that happen to line this evidence in a way that make him look guilty when he's innocent. That is one way to explain the evidence. Now, the other way to explain the evidence is that he is the one common causal factor that not only explains all the evidence, but it unifies all the evidence. That, to me, is the far more reasonable explanation. And this is exactly what circumstantial cases look like. They're cumulative. Now, in the book Cold Case, you know, I think Eugene mentioned last night that, so my bachelor's degree was in design, I have a master's degree in architecture, and then I became a police officer. So I was able to, in my work, use my limited drawing skills to illustrate things for juries and create presentations like these. So in our book, Cold Case, this is how I drew it, because they were too cheap to put in the way I wanted to illustrate it, but I just had to draw it with ink. Now, this process is I would never just use 8 pieces of evidence in a criminal trial. I would use 80 pieces of evidence that point to the same guy. And that's why we call this death by 1,000 paper cuts. Any one of these you might think, well, that doesn't mean anything. And that doesn't really mean anything. Yeah, you're right, they don't. They're a paper cut. But if you have enough of these, it becomes pretty obvious what's going on here. And this is what juries love. This is what you guys love. This is what you love about Dateline. Right? Okay. So this is what we try to do. We try to build cases cumulatively. Now, well, I love these cases are for 2 reasons. The first reason is that judges love these cases, and they instruct juries to treat circumstantial evidence the exact same way you would treat direct evidence. So stop saying it's just a circumstantial case, unless you're willing to say it's just a direct evidence case, and you wouldn't say that. We have a jury instruction in California, it's kind of like the one you have here in Tennessee, that says this: both direct and circumstantial evidences are acceptable type of evidence. Neither is entitled to any greater weight than the other. This is a jury instruction in every state in the United States. The other reason why I like circumstantial cases is because witnesses lie all the time. Look, I might misinterpret the circumstantial evidence, but it's not trying to deceive me. And often witnesses are. They want to help out their brother-in-law who's been accused of a crime. They want to be on an episode of Dateline. You'd be surprised why people will lie. So I have learned a long time ago never to trust eyewitnesses. I do not trust them. Instead, I test them. Now, if they pass the test, I trust them, because I'm commanded to trust them in the jury instructions. Now, how do we test an eyewitness? Well, it turns out there are 13 questions in our jury instructions that jurors are allowed to consider when they're listening to eyewitness testimony. I'm going to give it to you not 13 questions. I'm going to give it to you in the 4 categories that are covered by these 13 questions. And to make it even easier, I'm going to give it to you in single words. So here's what it comes down to. If the guy or gal who says they saw this was actually there, you got to demonstrate that you were there to see it. If you can be corroborated in some way, if you have not changed your story over time, and finally, if you don't have a bias that would cause you to lie, then you're to be considered reliable. I don't know. I don't like the way that guy looked. He has a really weird look. He reminds me of my Uncle Louis, and Louis was a terrible liar. Okay, get over it. I don't care what you think about how you have to disqualify him in one of these 4 areas, or you can't disqualify him. The way he looks is not a disqualifier. You got to give me a reason to disqualify him. And now I thought to myself, as a guy who was not a Christian, who had never opened a Bible, who didn't even know a Christian, who at least would talk about his faith, I started to examine the Gospels. I was 35 years old, didn't have any other way to examine them except given what I knew to do on my cold cases. So I thought, could I just apply this test to the gospel authors? If I did apply this test, would they pass? Now, we can't go through all of this today. Again, this is another class I teach at Biola. It takes me 17 hours for each class. But I can give you a couple of these, and I'm sending you the video for the rest. So that's why Eugene said, if you can't take notes, don't worry about it. I'm going to send you all these videos. They're high-def videos. They're large. I'll send you links you can download from, okay? You can keep them and just watch them whenever you want. So here we go. First one, were they really there to see what they said they saw? This young man was accused of killing an 11-year-old in our city in 1972. He confessed to the entire crime. It was a gruesome crime. This is my dad over here. It was my dad's case. This dude is not our killer. His entire confession, a 1,000-page transcript, is a lie. Now, why did he tell us this detailed lie? I don't know. Everyone's got different problems. This didn't get solved until last month. My dad opened the case and had the case in 72 for about 3 years. I opened the case in 2000 to 2003, and then it sat. We had a DNA marker that I put in our CODIS, our sexual offender database in California, and it did not hit. And it sat there until Ancestry DNA became the mechanism that everyone is using now to solve cases. So I want to thank all of you who are searching for your ancestry, because it's making it possible for me to arrest your family members. Thank you very much. And that's what happened here. His daughter, the killer's daughter, was searching for her ancestry, and it ended up being for us the way we solved this case. And we solved it 3 weeks ago. We press released it, and it sat for 47 years before it got solved. Sadly, the guy we identified was dead about 6 weeks before I got his DNA in 2003. So he's been dead for some time. But what's great about it is it's solved. It's the only case I've ever solved with DNA. Now, the question, of course, is why you can't trust this guy, though. This guy said he was the killer, and he wasn't the killer. He wasn't even there. If you're not there, you can't be the killer. You also can't be the witness, though. And that was my suspicion about the Gospels. Okay, we have this life of ministry of Jesus, those 3 years, and then we have a place in history where a council comes together and decides which Gospels should be in your Bible. That is called the Council of Laodicea. 360 years, 330 years after the fact. 330 years later, look, if the Gospels are written late in history over here, they can't be eyewitness accounts. The people who were the actual eyewitnesses have been dead for 300 years. Again, if you want to lie about Jesus, you just wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can say anything you want about Jesus. You can't consider them eyewitness accounts. And by the way, there are people who are writing books about this. I mentioned one of them last night, Bart Ehrman. He's got one of the best pedigreed biblical scholars in America, probably by far the most read biblical scholar in the world. He's written a number of books, as you can see here. And this is not a believer. He leads the Bible department at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he's not a believer. And he'll make claims like these are late or they've been changed over time. Really? We're going to address some of those claims today. I agree. If they're written late, they cannot be considered at all. They're too late to be eyewitness accounts. Of course, if they're written over here somewhere, the closer they get to the actual event, the more reliable they become. And that's my question, is how close are they to the event? Well, I'm going to show you by building a circumstantial case, which is why I taught you about circumstantial evidence, okay? So here we go. Bible scholars, what is that book written by Luke that describes the first century, the disciples of Jesus, and what they did after Jesus died on the cross, rose from the grave, and ascended into heaven? That is called the book of Acts. Listen, you're going to embarrass your pastor if you can't answer these simple questions, okay? The book of Acts, written by Luke. Anywhere in the book of Acts does Luke ever mention the destruction of the temple? We know when that occurred. It occurred around 70 A.D. You would think that Luke would mention it because he says that Jesus predicted it. Yet when it occurs, he never mentions it in the book of Acts. Why would you leave that out? Why would you leave out the siege of Jerusalem, a horrific period of time? This is far worse than the Twin Tower attacks. If you're writing a history that involves anything around the city of New York and you leave out the Twin Tower attacks, I'm going to ask you why you're leaving that out. The Romans barricaded the city, starved out its inhabitants. Anyone who tried to escape Jerusalem was crucified on the road outside of Jerusalem. They were starving so desperately that Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, says that when the Romans got inside the gates, they discovered a woman was eating her dead child who had died of starvation. She didn't want to die of starvation. Can you imagine? That's horrific, yet it's missing from the book of Acts. As a matter of fact, Paul is still alive at the end of the book of Acts. We know when and how he died. Luke doesn't mention it. Luke doesn't mention the death of Peter. He doesn't mention the death of James, the brother of Jesus. Now, think about this. Luke mentions deaths. He mentions the death of Stephen. He mentions the death of James, the brother of John. That dude's a nobody, okay? He died in 44. But he leaves out one of the most important characters in all of Christian early history, James, the brother of Jesus, who led the first church council ever, Acts 15, who was leading the largest group of Christians on the planet at the time, the church in Jerusalem. Yet he dies in 61 AD and you don't even write about it? Why not? Why is all this data missing? Well, one reasonable inference is it hasn't happened yet. You can't write about it if it hasn't happened yet. Let's test that theory. If Luke is written I'll just conservatively put it 1 year, the book of Acts, written by Luke, 1 year before the first missing event. I could easily put it 10 years before the first missing event. But I'm trying to be conservative here. How early is Luke? Luke writes 2 books. This is not a trick question. What's the other book he wrote? Luke. Very good. Which book did he write first? Oh, come on now. He wrote Luke first. That means we have to date Luke earlier than 60. And we know he wrote it first because he tells us so in the first verse of the book of Acts. In my prior book, the Gospel of Luke, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until he was taken into heaven. Good. Now let's test this. I dated that at 53 for a reason. There's a letter that Paul writes to Timothy. It's called 1 Timothy. And in this letter he says, take care of your church leaders. They deserve to be compensated. They work hard. He says, Timothy, take care of your church leaders because my Bible tells me so. He calls his Bible Scripture, and he says 2 verses tell me to take care of your church leaders. The first one is, do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. That's from Deuteronomy, Old Testament. Who cares? Paul's always quoting the Old Testament. But the second verse is interesting because he says, and the worker deserves his wages. He's calling this Scripture, yet this isn't from the Old Testament. This is from the New Testament. This is from the Gospel of Luke. He's quoting Luke and calling it Scripture as early as 63. Now, I said it's 53. And the reason why I said 53 is because he quotes it more than once. When he's writing the church in Corinth, he's trying to remind them of how he taught them the Lord's Supper. And he uses the Gospel of Luke again. And he quotes a larger piece of Scripture from the Gospel of Luke, Luke 22. Now think about this. He planted Corinth church probably around 51, and by 53 it's a mess, and he's writing his first letter, 1 Corinthians. But that means he was teaching this verse to them in 51 to remind them later in 53. How early is Luke's gospel? I don't know, but I think it's early. I think we're in the early 50s. And by the way, no scholar doubts that this letter was written by Paul in the early 50s, including Bart Ehrman. Now, this is really interesting, I think, for me. This is just the cop in me that loves words. Words are important. If you're going to give me a statement, I'm going to judge your words. We talked about this last night. Forensic statement analysis is what I use to become a Christian. We look at words that you use that you don't have to use, but you choose to use. They tell me something about you, and almost always that's going to include adverbs and adjectives. You never need to use any of those. When you decide to use them, they matter to me because they're optional words. I used to tell this to my daughter all the time, right? She's now in the Marine Corps. She's a military police in the Marine Corps, but when she was a teenager, I used to say, before you say anything, just know that I'm going to use every word you say. I'm going to hold that against you. And by the way, all the words you could have chosen to use but chose not to use, I'm going to hold those against you too. Go ahead. And she used to drive her crazy. Same thing here. I want to show you the first verse of Luke's gospel. He tells us that he's not an eyewitness, but instead he is interviewing those who were eyewitnesses. He was an eyewitness to the book of Acts, and that's where he met all the people who knew Jesus. And he slips into first person in the book of Acts. But the Gospel of Luke, this is him talking to the eyewitnesses. And he says, therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. There are 3 optional words in this sentence that matter to me as an investigator. Here's the first one. He says, I've carefully investigated it. Why is he saying that? Why is he saying I carefully investigated it? Well, if you compare it, it might just be that he's trying to distinguish his book from others that they know about. And there is another book out there at the time about Jesus that is less careful. It's called the Gospel of Mark. If you compare Mark to Luke, you'll see that Luke is far more meticulous, far more careful. Then he says he's writing this to most excellent Theophilus. Well, why is he using that expression? That's an expression in the first century that was typically used for city leaders. We don't know who Theophilus is, but he was probably somebody important. Then he uses this word, which is the killer for me. He says, I'm writing for you an orderly account. An orderly account? Do you know what that word means? It doesn't mean tidy. It means it's in the correct chronological order. Why do you need to tell me that? If you're writing a history of Jesus, don't I assume it's in the right order? I mean, who writes an account where you mix everything up? Who would do that? Well, it might be that he's trying to distinguish his account from another account that's out there early in history, and there is another account out there that's not in the right order. It's called the Gospel of Mark. And we know it's not in the right order. If you compare Mark to Luke, you will see that some of those things are in different places. They don't line up in terms of order. And we know also from a very early bishop in the church named Papias, who tells us that Mark wrote his account sitting at the feet of Peter in Rome. And Papias says, it's been written in the first century, says, you know what? He says that Mark's account is accurate, if not orderly. And the word he uses for orderly is the exact same word that Luke is using. Papias tells us that Mark's account is not in the right order because Peter's not teaching his personal history with Jesus. He's preaching in themes. And from those themed preachings, Mark is writing an account. What Luke is telling us here is, hey, I got Mark's stuff in here, but I got it in the right order. And who do you think he quotes more than any other source in his gospel? He quotes Mark more than anyone else, word for word. But that means that Mark's account has to be available to us so he can quote it. Mark's account's even earlier. Now, do you see how close we are in history? We do this all the time in timelines to determine if a suspect is available to commit a crime. Here what we're saying is, do we have good reason to believe these authors are available to us to be eyewitnesses, or at least to have access to eyewitnesses? Remember, it's far easier to write the account and lie about Jesus if you can do it when everybody is already dead. But it is early. There's good evidential reason to believe it's early. Doesn't mean it's true. It's the first piece, though. Now, the second piece I think is critical, and this is what takes the most time in my class. It's going to be verified. And guess what? I'm going to skip that today because I have to get this done to get you to a little bit of out of here by noon, which would be nice, right? To be out by noon. But I'm going to send this to you in a video, and I'll show you at the end how much stuff there is to cover. But I want to go to one that's even more, I think, troublesome, and that is it accurate over time? I had a suspect on another Dateline case that killed his wife in 1984, I think it was, and got rid of her body and claimed that she ran away. And I had no crime scene because it wasn't worked. No, it was 1981. We didn't work it as a homicide until 1987. No crime scene, he moved away. No physical evidence. We thought she was a runaway. Turns out he murdered her, got rid of her body. How do we make the case? He continued to change his story over time. That's basically it. If you change your story over time, there's a good chance you're not telling me the truth. And his story got more robust with different details. He wasn't having a memory erosion. He had a memory recurrence. It was awesome. But that's what got him convicted. Now, once we convicted him and sentenced him, at the sentencing hearing, he confessed to the crime and gave us the location of the body. So we know he's the right guy. But we convicted him not being able to answer very important key questions. How did he kill her? Where did he kill her? What did he do with her body? How did he move her car? How did he make sure the kids didn't hear about this? Why is there no blood in the house? No idea how to answer those questions. You can determine something is true even with significant unanswered questions. Do you know that? You got unanswered questions about God? I get you. I feel the same way. It shouldn't keep us from being able to render a verdict, though. Didn't keep these jurors. Now, by the way, let me cover one more thing real quick. The only thing I ask the dispatcher to do for me when I'm assigned to a homicide is I tell her, okay, I'm going to be an hour before I get there because I'm in bed, I'm asleep, it's 2 in the morning, I got to get dressed in a suit, and I got to get out to the scene. So it's going to be an hour. So do me a favor, have the officers who are on scene one thing only. Separate the eyewitnesses. Do you know why I do that? Because if I don't separate those eyewitnesses, I will get there and their stories will all be identical because they've had time to talk to each other before I got there. Reliable, true eyewitness account never, ever match up. They never have. They never will. It could only happen 2 hours ago. You'll still get 5 versions of the story. That's okay. My job is to put the 5 versions back together as a puzzle. If you think, oh, I've read the Gospels, they seem slightly different. Duh! You don't think they had time to make one gospel and throw away the others? Reliable eyewitnesses never, ever agree. That's what got me interested in the Gospels. They weren't exactly in alignment. That's exactly the way I see eyewitness accounts. My job is to figure out what the differences are. Why are there differences at all? So let's go to this issue. Even if it was early, my question is, how do we know it got to the council without being changed? Bart's written a book about this called How Jesus Became God. His claim is that there is a version of Jesus that's true, but it's a much simpler version. A Jesus who was a preaching rabbi who taught good sermons, but he didn't perform miracles. He didn't rise from the grave. That's all legendary stuff that was added over time until the Jesus of history became the Christ of Christianity. That's his claim. Something similar happens in crime scenes. You have a crime scene, and you have a courtroom 30 years later. Now the question is, I have a piece of evidence in the crime scene, this casing. I'm going to bring it into trial, and I'm going to tell you that there's an extractor pin mark on that casing that identifies that casing to the handgun of our defendant. Little mark on the casing. Really? Well, how do I know that actually was part of the original evidence. For all I know, some detective could have pulled it out of property 10 years later, etched in the little extractor pin mark so it matches the gun, puts it back in property. The crime lab has no idea it's been altered. I get it years later. I have no idea that it's been altered. I bring it into trial as though it's part of it's the same original casing. It's not the original casing anymore. It's been altered. Couldn't something similar happen with the gospel? You have an original early gospel? Fine. But how do I know if it's the same gospel that I eventually get into the canon? How do I know how many times somebody has not either changed it intentionally or unintentionally? I have 330 years to work with. Think about it. Then finally someone brings it into the council. They're just like me. They have no idea that it's been altered. That is his claim. That is the claim of many skeptics who think that the Bible has been altered over time, the New Testament. Well, how would you even determine if that's true or not? How would you check that? I'll tell you how we do it in criminal trials. Okay, so we've got our crime scene. We've got our courtroom. We ask a question. Was there an officer at the crime scene who saw that casing, who took do you guys know what a Polaroid is? Do we have time? No, I was going to give you a little Polaroid test, but we don't have time for that, so we're just going to keep on going. But they used to have these cameras you could take a picture immediately. Nobody had phones back in those days, right? So we would take Polaroids. Now, there's an officer who did that. Maybe he wrote a supplemental report describing the casing. Does he describe the extractor pin mark in his report? I hope so. Did you see it in the Polaroid? He's going to give it to somebody like my dad. My dad would write a second report describing what he received from the first officer, maybe even take his own Polaroid. We used to call these investigative Polaroids because we couldn't get 35 millimeter shots back. It took like 2 weeks to get them developed. So we needed to take Polaroids so we can go out and work the case in the first 2 weeks. Then, of course, he's going to bring it to the crime lab. They'll write a very, very succinct report, and they'll do all kinds of pictures. And when I finally pick it up, I write a report in which I describe what I'm picking up. So we have our picture after picture after picture, report after report after report, describing the casing from back in 1980 all the way to the present. These are like links in a chain that connect the past to the present. And that's why we call this the chain of custody. And for every important piece of evidence in any criminal trial, you will have to demonstrate and show the chain of custody and that it hasn't changed over time. Well, is there a chain of custody in the New Testament? There is. I'll show you one. So here's our crime scene. Here's our courtroom. Our first officer at the scene, to start with the Gospel of John, let's say. So John is there. He takes a picture of Jesus. He writes his supplemental report. But what's in his report? Well, how would we know? Well, who's the next officer in the chain of custody? Who does he give his report to? Turns out there were 3 personal students of John who sat at his feet and listened to what he had to say about Jesus. Their names were Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias. Now, if we didn't have John's report, we could simply ask these guys, what did John tell you about Jesus? Was he less spectacular? Was he less supernatural? You know, he didn't rise from the grave, right? It was a simpler version of Jesus, right? Well, how would we know what these guys would tell us? Well, it turns out we're lucky. They wrote their own reports because they became leaders in the local church. So, for example, Ignatius wrote 7 letters to local congregations describing what he had learned from John. We can now look at those and say, is Jesus different in those reports? We don't have anything from Papias. But we do have, now we know that Papias wrote stuff because Eusebius in church history tells us that Papias wrote stuff. But I don't have anything. But we do have 1 letter from Polycarp. So now we can compare these letters. Does Ignatius describe Jesus differently than John? Does he describe Jesus differently than Polycarp? Does Polycarp describe Jesus differently than Ignatius? We can start to triangulate. Now, it turns out the next person in the chain of custody is a student of Ignatius and Polycarp. His name is Irenaeus. Irenaeus became a huge leader in the church, wrote a lot of stuff, but most of it remains, so we can read it. He even made a list of 24 New Testament books that he was using with his students. Don't let anyone tell you that the canon of Scripture is assembled in a church council in the 4th century. That is not true. That council confirms what's been in use for hundreds of years. What was being quoted immediately by the first students of the eyewitnesses, what was being listed by their student, Irenaeus, hundreds of years before a church council. Irenaeus had a student. His name is Hippolytus. Hippolytus got in trouble. He was held in custody. He died in custody. There's good reason to believe. Well, Origen says, another church, early church father, Origen says that he listened to Hippolytus preach, but I don't think that makes you necessarily his student. So I'm going to stop the chain of custody right here. I can trust these links, but remember, if the earliest links in your chain of custody match the last link, you're good to go. So now the question is, now by the way, there's more chains of custody. Here's one from Paul through Tatian, heel to toe, teacher to student. Here's one from Peter through to Eusebius into the church council. Heel to toe, these are teachers and students. So you can trace these and see, is the story of Jesus changing? Look, if you lost the Gospels, you don't have any New Testament documents at all. But all you had were the first students of the eyewitnesses. What would you know about Jesus? You'd be stuck with the exact same Jesus we have today. This dude's story has never changed. Been the same from the beginning of time. Never changes. Now, I'm going to address that claim I made last night. Remember, I kind of challenged you last night? Because we have no original version of any of these New Testament books. We have no original documents. How can you trust when we don't have an original document? As Bart would say, we don't have a copy of the copy of the copy of the copy of the original. The first copy we sometimes have is in the 3rd or 4th century. And when we compare the most ancient versions to each other, the most ancient copies we have, they don't match. Let me show you what he's talking about. Let me just go to a one page from the Gospel of John. Here it is. I've enlarged this 4 times. So whatever I show you here, it's 4 times worse, okay? Because I'm only showing you 1/4 of the page enlarged. So I'm going to give you an example of where early documents will disagree. Here's one right here. It's kind of blurry, but just get through with me. I'll show you it. Here, in this version, it's translated from a particular manuscript. It says that I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. But in another equally ancient manuscript, it says something slightly different. It says, I'm not going up yet. The word yet is added. Now, would you agree these don't seem to be a big difference? And even Bart would say that of all these differences, none impact the identity or nature of Jesus. None impact any orthodox claim of Christianity. He'll admit that. But you'll see a bunch of these on every page. If you've not been using the NASB or the ESV, these are in your footnotes in those Bibles. So if you've been using those 2 texts, open them up and start reading your footnotes. That's how I'm finding them, okay? They've been in plain sight this entire time, but no one's looking. Here, for example, is another one on the same page. In one ancient manuscript, it says, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? In another ancient manuscript, it says, how is it that he knows his letters? It means the same thing, but you can see it's very different. Let me show you another one. Same page. If anyone is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. Another ancient text says, his will, not God's will. Now, I'm not showing you all the variations, even in this 25% enlargement, because there are more on the other page. But this is why Bart looks at all of these variations on this page, and he says, you realize that there are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. And that is true. Even Daniel Wallace, who's not related to me, he's a scholar at Dallas Theological Seminary, DTS, and he will tell you that this is true. This is not a monkeying with the numbers kind of thing. But it's meaningless. And I want to show you how to overcome this objection. All right, you ready? I have a daughter-in-law. Her name is Olivia. She's been my daughter-in-law for 3 years. When I first met her, we had her over for dinner. And after dinner, she texted me on, by the way, I hate iPhones, right? Because you can't trust Siri. How many of you have trusted Siri to transcribe anything? Okay, that's a nightmare, right? So I'm driving, and I get this text from Olivia to say thanks for dinner. I've only met her one time. So I wanted to text her back, but I'm driving. So I said to Siri, text Olivia. What a mistake. So I wanted to text her something simple like this: Olivia, looking forward to seeing you again soon. That's pretty straightforward. But Siri does not understand the word Olivia. So it doesn't translate Olivia. Instead, it translates, I love you. Looking forward to seeing you again soon. And suddenly I get no response from Olivia. She's not responding at all. So I get to my destination about 20 minutes later. And I look at my phone, I go, oh my gosh, I said I love you. We still laugh about this all the time. You can't trust Siri. You also can't trust the autocorrection on your phone, can you? Oh, you know what I'm talking about here, right? Like if you don't have your glasses on and you're just typing along, that phone can mess with you, okay? I'll give you an example of this. My son David, right? He is a doctor, but when he was in med school, this was extremely expensive. We couldn't help him because, hey, you want to be a doctor? That's on you. You want to be a biochemist? I can afford that. But doctor thing, that's on you. So let's say that David needs some cash because he's strapped, and I'm deciding I'm going to meet him. I'll meet him next Wednesday. Let's meet at Starbucks, the one on Main Street, and I'll go ahead and I'll bring you $5,000. Meet you at 4 p.m. So I text him. But there's an error in my text. Can you see it? It's kind of confusing. The number's it's the number, okay, I get it. So, and starving instead of Starbucks, that doesn't make much sense, right? So I'm going to re-text him because I don't think he's going to understand this. And sure enough, he doesn't. So let's do it again, make sure I get it right, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and re-text him. So this is my second effort. I used the word weakness instead of, well, I didn't use that word, it just transcribed it that way. It was supposed to be Wednesday. So, and I got two, and you know what? I'm a stickler for this, so I'm going to go ahead and text him again. Here's my third effort. Now I've called him a nerd, okay? He's got a good sense of humor. I'm sure he'll be okay with that. There you go. See, it's all good. So I'm going to get this right. So I text him now a fourth time. Now I'm running naked down the street. I'm streaking down the street. I can't let that sit there, so I'm going to have to fix that right now. So I'm going to go ahead and do another one. This is our fifth text. Oh, it's got the word meek instead of meat. It's close though, right? I think that's pretty close. Now, I think at this point, David's going to be over this. He's like, okay, enough already. I got it. Oh, no. No, I'm a perfectionist. So if I have to, I will text the holy dog snot out of this kid, okay? And I'll just continue to text him until I get it right. Now, it turns out every single one of these texts contains another different kind of error. Let me ask you a question. What day am I going to meet David? What business? Where's it located? What time? And for how much money? How do you know that to be true when you don't have a single inerrant text? As a matter of fact, now you clearly have more errors and more variations between the texts than you have letters. Forget about words. Then you have letters in the text. Yet you think you know how to return to the original. Why? Because it turns out the number of variants is meaningless. What matters is the number of copies you have to compare to one another. And that is the embarrassment of riches we have with ancient manuscripts. Is we have so many copies. We don't just say, okay, I'm going to translate the ESV from this one Codex Sinaiticus, and I'm not going to compare it to anything else. No, in fact, what we do is we take a body of manuscripts to create any one translation. So, for example, in the most common translations, we use a number of ancient manuscripts. And we compare these to each other to remove the variations and get back to the original. The same way you were able to remove the variations and get back to my original text. Are we clear? So while it sounds rhetorically powerful that there are many variations, well, how do you know that, Bart? Because you're doing the first half of the job, but you refuse to do the second half, which everybody else is doing. Let's finish this up. Last area of concern for me is bias. Is there a reason why they might be lying to us? Look, when you go to a drunken bar fight, we have this biker bar in our town called The Crest, and every time you go there, there's one drunk biker trying to accuse another drunk biker of some kind of, bad behavior. So the question is, how do you trust anyone? It's all about motive. What drives us to tell a lie? It turns out only three things drive us to tell a lie. They're the same three things that cause any murder. You don't walk into a death scene and go, oh my gosh, there's 1,000 reasons why someone would kill her. No, there aren't. There are only three reasons why somebody would kill her. Only three. You find me somebody in one of those three areas, we're done. So what are the three motives behind murder? The same three motives behind lies. The same three motives behind any sin you've ever committed. You've only committed them for one of these three reasons. That's it. Can you guess what they are? The three motives behind any misbehavior? The first one's pretty obvious. It's financial greed. Okay, that's behind a lot of stupid. The second one is kind of, you probably can guess this one too, it's sexual lust. That's behind a lot of stupid too. The third one, though, is more nuanced because it encompasses everything else, and that is the pursuit of power. When one gangster says, I don't get disrespected in my neighborhood, and kills another gangster, what's driving that? Authority, power, respect is in the third category. When someone walks in and kills 30 people who just happen to look differently than they do or hold a different political position, what is causing that? Authority, power, respect is in the third category. Are we on the same page now on that? Okay. So if we're saying that the disciples are lying to us, okay, great. We know what drives lies. If they're lying to us about the Jesus story, it's for one of these three reasons, because these are the only three reasons why anyone lies, ever in the history of lies. So which is it? What are they getting out of this from a money perspective? Do you honestly think that they're lying about this for money? Or for girlfriends? And by the way, I don't think any skeptic even thinks that, but Bart would say it's about the third category. Look, if you can lie and say that you're an authority in a new religious worldview, well, then suddenly you're somebody where before you were nobody. So that's what's driving this, he thinks. Oh, really? So most of the New Testament is written by a guy named Paul. You're telling me Paul's doing it not for sex, not for money. He's doing it for power. Really? So Paul had power and authority in the larger religious community called Judaism. And in that community, he had the power to draw papers to execute Christians. So you're saying that one day he decides, you know what, I'm going to jump out of this position I hold right now of authority, power, and respect as a Jew, trained by one of the best rabbis of the day, and have the authority to draw papers on these Christians. And I'm going to jump in with these Christians and get my butt kicked all over the planet for the next 30 years, hoping to someday return to the position I already have with a larger group that already has political influence with the Romans? Seriously, is that what we're thinking? Yeah, it's possible. It's just not reasonable. If you were a leader in the first century in Christianity, you were like the deer in this cartoon right here. That's a bummer of a birthmark, Hal. That is a bummer of a birthmark if you're a deer, right? And that's what you had on your forehead if you were a Christian leader in the first century, because you know what happened to these guys, the price they paid for their claims. Now, listen, some of you in this room would say, I am willing to die for what I believe as a Christian. Let me tell you how much evidential power that would have. None. None at all. Because all kinds of people are willing to die for what they don't know is a lie. That happens all the time. But this is the one group that would know if it's a lie. They're not like you and me. They're the one group that would know if it's true or not before they actually die for it. That's why their deaths are so much more powerful, evidentially. That there are 3 eyewitnesses to the golden plates. When Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, on the end page you'll see there are 3 eyewitnesses listed who allegedly saw those golden plates. David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, and Martin Harris. These 3 guys, David, Oliver, and Martin, they all were thrown out of the church or voluntarily left the church after those statements. Martin was a part of 6 other Christian denominations after Mormonism. If someone's willing to walk away from their base claims, good chance it's not true. These guys never walked away. You know, we started with this guy, and we built a case circumstantially and cumulatively. Now we're going to look at the issue of Jesus. We build the case the same way, guys. We built it in 4 areas. First is, are they early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses and in front of other people who would know if they weren't true? Yes, they are early enough. The second is, can they be corroborated in some way? And we didn't talk about any of this evidence. But I'm going to send that to you. Then we talked about the third area. Has it been changed over time? Has it stayed accurate? And we have good reasons in the chain of custody to believe that's true. And finally, is there any reason why these people would lie to us? This is what the cumulative case for Christianity looks like. It's built like this. That's why if you ask me, well, why are you a Christian? I'm about to say to you, well, do you have 2 hours? Because I'm not going to share my testimony with you, because my testimony doesn't matter. And guess what, folks? Your testimony doesn't matter either. Here's what matters. Is it true? Because trust me, my Mormon family, 6 brothers and sisters, all raised by my stepmother, they have wonderful testimonies. Doesn't make Mormonism true. We have to be able to demonstrate to our young people, is this true? So when you ask me, why are you a Christian? I always will put it this way. Well, I'll tell you, it's going to take me some time. I don't do this on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook because I have to go through all of that stuff. But I can tell you this, I'm not a Christian because it works for me. This doesn't work for me. Christianity is hard. In Southern California, maybe it's even harder than it is here. I don't know. For your kids, it's going to get harder. Let me tell you, my wife and I were together for 18 years before either one of us became a Christian. And we've been together 22 since. And I will tell you, if you ask her which half was easier, she'll always say the 18 was easier. You know why? Because it's really easy to throw the dart against the wall and just go draw the bullseye around wherever the dart lands. And that's what we did for 18 years. I wasn't trying to fix something that was broken. I had a great life, great career, great kids, great marriage before I became a Christian. I wasn't raised in the church. That's not why I'm a Christian. And I had no experience that demonstrated Christianity was true for me. I simply investigated and I discovered it's true. I'm a Christian because it's true. And I will tell you, my sons, we just taught a class at Biola together, and my sons, I was surprised to hear it, especially my doctor's son, because he's a microbiologist first, and then he becomes an anesthesiologist. And I'm thinking, how did he get through those hard sciences in school? He said, because I knew no matter what position I was in or what I was thinking of that day, I knew you'd already taught me that it was true evidentially, so I eventually had to come back to it. That's why we teach it this way. Now, if you miss something, what we're going to do is we're going to send it to you by text. So you're going to text, like we said last night, this number, this pagan number 66866 that I didn't get to pick. Although I should, just for laughs, I should just call them and say, just give me 3 6s, because no one will forget that, right? Just text the word detective to 66866, and I'm going to send you all this material in a link. You're going to get it tonight. You're going to get it today as soon as you do that. But you're going to need to copy that out and email it to yourself because you're going to need a computer to download all this stuff on. Make sense? Now we're going to take a 5-minute stand-up break. So everyone just stand up. We're not going to leave the room. We're going to go 5 minutes. Then we're going to hop into the next session. And then we'll give you a break after the next session. Is that okay? We have a lot to cover. So just stand up and talk awkwardly amongst yourselves. All right. I know it's a very short break, but I want to have time for Q&A at the end. So let's just hop right back in if we can. Now, I'm going to take a turn here because and I was just asked a great question during the break about, some of you may, for example, I've got good friends who also work in this area. Josh McDowell and Sean McDowell are friends of mine. As a matter of fact, I co-wrote the last book with Sean, Josh's son. Sean is also a very fine apologist in his own right. He's got a PhD in apologetics. We teach together at Biola. And so there are some things you're going to hear also from books like Evidence That Demands a Verdict. But you'll probably see that the stuff I'm talking about is not in that. Not there. Here's why. Most of the people who have written books like Evidence That Demands a Verdict have never actually used evidence to get a verdict. So I'm just trying to throw this in a way that I know would be rhetorically powerful in front of a jury. If I don't think it would work in front of a jury, I won't bring it up. Make sense? Because I have a tendency, I always think about what would the defense attorney going to say? What's he going to say that's going to basically take my entire argument and trash it? And I'm always sensitive to that. All right, let's get after now. We're going to talk about the most important piece of evidence in the entire Christian worldview. Again, this is out of our book, Cold Case Christianity. We're going to talk about chapter 4. Chapter 4 of this book. We had officers that were dispatched to a death scene. And it was a suspicious death, so we're going to get coroners out there. But first, our officers have to go on scene. It was a very well-known drug addict in our community. She was somebody who was just mixed her drug use. She also was a bank robber. I had met her as a bank robber. I was working robbery homicide, which means I work a lot of bank robberies, so back in the day. And so sure enough, I had met her this way. And when they got to her house, her roommate says they found her dead in her bed, so they called the police right away. So now officers who also know her to be a very committed drug addict, they are en route to her house. When they get there, they find this nightstand. This is her nightstand next to her bed. I'll give it to you a little larger. You can see that she's a heroin user. So this is her heroin needle here, heroin needle here. This is her blood, which is coming out of the needle. This is a heroin needle here. But she also would smoke rock cocaine simultaneously. So these are her rock pipes down here. You do this together for very long, it leads to bad results. So sure enough, she's now dead in her bed next to this nightstand. Given what you know so far about this woman, what do you think was the reasonable inference of the officers who arrived? Overdose. So they waited for the coroner's investigator to get there. We have a ton of homicides in Los Angeles County, so it takes forever for a coroner's investigator to get there. And they just are body collectors for the most part. So the investigator gets there, pulls down the blankets, and sure enough, this woman has been stabbed to death. The officers, while they were waiting for the investigator to get there, didn't even bother to pull down the blankets. And you know why? Because they thought they knew why she had died before they got there. She's dead in her bed, she's a drug addict, she's overdosed. Before they even got there, they were thinking that. When they got there, they saw this, and their presupposition ended up clouding their judgment. They didn't bother to go any further. If you're not careful, what you think about the answer will cloud your judgment too. Thinking you know the answer before you start is deadly. The first chapter we write about in Cold Case is don't be a know-it-all. Don't think you know the answer before you even pull down the blankets. Or you won't even bother to pull down the blanket. Why am I telling you this? Because we're trying to get to the most reasonable inference from evidence, because that is the judicial standard, as we've been talking about all weekend. It's not beyond a possible doubt, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. But how do we decide what is reasonable? That's what we talked about last night. I know some of you weren't here, but last night we showed you a death scene, and we said we simply compare evidences against possible explanations. And when you do this thing called abductive reasoning, comparing evidences against explanations, you can arrive at the most reasonable explanation based on evidence. And so that's what I decided to do, not only with the existence of God, which we talked about last night, but I thought, okay, what is the most important single piece of evidence in the Christian worldview? Well, we know what it is because Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians. He says the most important piece of evidence is the resurrection of Jesus. If this didn't happen, Paul says, not only are you to be pitied because you have no life after death, because there is no resurrection for anybody, but he also says that we have been false witnesses. Everything we've said to you is a lie because we're liars. I knew, as an early investigator in this, all I had to do was examine this one piece of evidence. Is the resurrection true? If it's not, we should stop meeting. If it is true, it should change the way we think about Jesus. So how are we going to do this? Abductive reasoning. We'll make a list of evidences, a list of explanations. We'll cross out the ones that don't make any sense and see where we are. Now, what would count as evidence in the room? As an atheist, I would have told you I agreed about 4 things when it came to Jesus, but only 4 things as a non-believer. So let's list those as evidence in the room. I would have said, yes, I believe that Jesus was crucified and buried. I'm not a Jesus myther. If there are people here who have that question, save it for the Q&A. Some people will actually claim that Jesus never even lived. He is just a recreation of prior mythologies that resemble him. But I've studied those. That's stupid, okay? Even Bart Ehrman, who doesn't believe Jesus is God, has written a book against the Jesus mythers. So he believes that Jesus lived, just doesn't think he was God. But I would have given you this. This doesn't matter. People are being crucified for their faith today. Someone will die this week on a cross for their Christian faith in the world. This does not make it true. You could believe this is true, yet Christianity is still false. I held that position. I believed this was true, but Christianity was still false. I also would have said, yeah, there was an empty tomb, because the way to end this in the first century is pretty easy. Get the body of Jesus, drag it around town. It's game over. Or get any of the eyewitnesses to recant. That would also be game over. But they didn't get the body of Jesus, so the tomb's empty. I can explain that a number of ways. This could be true, and that could be true, yet Christianity could still be false. I believe these 2 things, yet I denied Christianity was true, because there's ways to explain this. You just steal the body, and you're good to go. Third thing, they said they saw a risen Christ. So what? People say all kinds of stupid things that aren't true. You don't believe everything your kids tell you, do you? I don't either. And finally, they did seem to be committed to their claims. So, all kinds of people. People are flying planes into buildings committed to false claims. This does not make Christianity true. None of these 4 things makes Christianity true. And that's all I was going to give you. Now, of course, I have to explain those 4 things. If it's not true, then tell me how these 4 things can be true, yet Christianity is still false. Well, I would have given you a number of explanations. As a matter of fact, I think there are 6 ways to explain those 4 things as an atheist. I'm going to list them on the wall here. The 7th is your explanation. Your explanation is simply that they are accurately recording what happened to Jesus in the Gospels. But what if one of the first 6 is a better explanation? For example, what if they were just wrong about Jesus dying in the first place? Look, if he didn't die, then we just have a badly beaten, unconscious Jesus on the cross. He is being resuscitated, but not resurrected. Maybe he didn't die at all. How will we investigate that? Well, I think there are some actual clues in the text that I find compelling. Let me show you one here in the Gospel of John. In John, it says that Jesus was crucified alongside 2 thieves. Now, interestingly, when they went to collect the bodies, the 2 thieves are not dead. They had to break their legs to make sure they were dead. And they didn't break the legs of Jesus, so maybe no one's dead yet. You killed the 2 thieves, but you didn't do this to Jesus, so he's still alive. Instead, they just pierced his side with a spear and got a sudden flow of blood and water. Now, what's interesting about that is the last expression, the blood and water part. I don't know if you know this or not, but that blood and water was confusing. It's confusing even now. Why would you see a separation of blood and water? Do you realize for 1,000 years that anyone who read this text could not explain the separation of water part? I only know this because I've read every church father who writes about that water separation. And I don't care who's writing about it, they'll say it's not really water. It can't be water. Why would water come out of his body? No, it must be a symbol of something. You know, a symbol of the baptism, a symbol of the Holy Spirit. It's a symbol. It couldn't have been real water. Who's ever seen, why would you ever see that? A separation of blood and water. So I don't care which church father you read, and I've read them all, they all say it's not really water. It can't be water. Why? Because these guys don't understand the biology of death, because we didn't really understand this until about another 500 to 1,000 years. What happens when you get badly beaten, remember, Jesus' path to the cross is different than the thieves. He starts getting a beating early and often until he finally gets to the cross. If you've ever seen somebody who suffered a fatal injury but has not yet died, like at a car accident or at a murder scene, you'll see that the body starts to shut down. We call this circulatory shock, right? Your organs are starting to conserve energy so they can try to function as long as they can. If your heart fails and you have a cardiac arrest, then you're going to suffer one of 2 forms of effusion. The first is called pericardial effusion, and that's where that sac around your heart will fill up with water. But if you stab that sac, I've been in autopsies, and if you stab that sac, you won't see a separation of blood and water, because it's, number one, it's not as thick as this, it looks like it is, and number 2, the heart is a rich depository of blood, so it looks like running blood. But if you happen to be in the right position when you die, water can also collect in your lungs, and that's called pleural effusion. And if that happens, and I stab your chest cavity, you will see a separation of blood and water. But what are the odds of you being in an upright position when you die? Well, Jesus was in an upright position when he died. But if you're seeing water come out of his lungs, it's because his heart's already failed. You've got a good reason to believe Jesus is dead just from this one verse of Scripture. And nobody even... Do you think that John was clever enough to say, you know what, I'm going to include this very little-known biological fact that no one's even going to discover for another 1,000 years, and then when they finally discover what this is, they're going to go, wow, look how legitimate this is. I don't think so. I think he's just describing what he saw, which was confusing to everyone until we understood the science of death. Now, many of you in this room understand the science of death because you work in a field where you touch dead bodies. How many of you touch a dead body regularly as part of your work? I know it's weird, but raise your hand if you do. Come on, there's only a couple people who do. Nurses, usually, maybe the coroner's office, or we get to touch dead bodies a lot. I think that you are confused about dead bodies. I think you think dead bodies look like what they look like in movies or on TV. Do you realize they don't look anything like that? You can tell a dead body from across the room. I don't have to get up on a dead body to know he's dead and not unconscious. I can tell that from across the room. Maybe it's because I see a lot of dead bodies. Why is that important? Okay, in 2019, if your family member dies, you are going to call either the funeral home or you're going to call the coroner's office if it's suspicious. You are not going to grab your Aunt Mildred and throw her over your shoulder and take her down to the funeral home. You're not doing that. As a matter of fact, most of you won't even bother to touch that dead person. You'll wait until the funeral home comes and gets the body, right? That's why you're so unfamiliar with what death looks like. But you realize in the first century, there was no mortuary. There was no coroner's office. Everyone took care of their own dead. People in the first century understood death. They had to handle it. And because you guys don't, I want to educate you on what death looks like, okay? Because I know the first century they understood this. I'm going to take you downtown to Los Angeles to the coroner's office. This is the coroner's office in downtown LA. It's a beautiful building. You walk up these steps right here, and if you walk over to the right, behind this window right there, that is the Los Angeles County Coroner's gift shop. That's right, there's a gift shop, and you can buy souvenirs. Like this t-shirt that says, our bodies of work speak for themselves. Or this mouse pad. Who uses a mouse pad anymore? I don't know. But it says, we're dying for your business. I used to get t-shirts that said, we're dying for your business. Pretty ridiculous, right? It turns out if you are assigned a homicide as a homicide investigator in Los Angeles County, you have to attend the autopsy. Because in the preliminary hearing, the coroner is not going to show up for the preliminary hearing. They're too busy. I'm going to have to testify for the coroner at the prelim. And that means I have to be there to watch the autopsy so I can testify like him at the prelim. So I have been to tons of autopsies. They are pretty remarkable. Have you ever been to an autopsy? Raise your hand. Pretty cool, right? Well, you know, of course, being a doctor. But autopsies are like bizarre things, okay? They take the back of your skull, they cut the scalp, they pull your head, your hair over your face, they take off your cap of your head to take your brain out. They cut a Y right down to your stomach, they open up the skin, they take pruning shears, I kid you not, and they clip out your rib cage, they pull off your rib cage, and they empty you out like a canoe and take out every organ, test it, stick it all back in a black plastic bag, stick it back in your chest, put your rib cage back on, sew up your chest, and send you to your funeral home. There is no nobility in death, okay? And it happens not in this building, it happens next door. Next door downstairs, there are examination rooms. And they don't look like this, okay? This is like what the ideal examination room could look like, I suppose, if you didn't do 500 autopsies a week, all right? But if you have to do that many autopsies, it starts to get messy. It's disgustingly messy. As a matter of fact, there's a reason why these are metal. When I first started in 1988, those were wood. Yeah, that's right. Why is that bad? Because eventually you can't wash those things clean anymore. They're like big sponges. They just stink. They stink of death. You know, we don't always find people the first 5 minutes they're dead. Sometimes we don't find them for 5 days. Bloaters. They're disgusting, okay? And they put them on the table next to you, and you're just like, oh, please, please, let me get my autopsy done and get out of here before you cut that guy open. Because the minute you cut that guy open, it's going to get really nasty in here. And do you realize there's a sign on the back wall? A sign that says, no eating in the examination room. Yeah, like people are going to eat in that room. I don't know, what would you eat there? I don't know, liver sandwich. I don't know what it would be. So I want to teach you what you see in autopsies. It's called the mortis triad. I'm only teaching you this because I'm sure that in the first century, people were aware of the mortis triad. This is what death looks like and feels like. We just don't know it in 2019. Unless you're doing this kind of work. The first mortis is that when you die, you start to cool down. It's like your body starts to be cooler to the touch. You can tell a dead person by just touching them. That is called algor mortis. You also start to get stiff. You're standing on that cross for a period of time. It's not we're going to take the nails out of your hands and you're just going to flop down. No, you're going to actually have to probably be pushed down into place because you start to stiffen. That is called a rigor mortis. But the real giveaway is what happens to your blood. Because if your heart is not pushing blood, gravity is drawing it. Something's drawing that blood. Something's moving your blood. Either your heart's moving it or gravity's moving it. So if you die on your back and I get there and I roll you over, your back is going to be discolored, like a bruise, because all the blood has now rushed to your back. If you die in an upright position, your feet will swell and turn purple because of this mortis. It's called liver mortis. This is the mortis triad. Now I'm telling you this because is it possible that this guy could have water come out of his chest and then nobody would notice this? Yeah, it's possible. I just don't think it's reasonable. And that's why I crossed it out. Maybe they're lying about this. There are how many of you like conspiracy theories? Come on, you know it. You read books and you like conspiracy theories. I know you do. Raise your hand. Tina, raise your hand. I know you do. Okay, raise them really high. Everyone who likes conspiracy theories, just raise your hand high. Raise it for me. Raise your other hand high, too. Get them both up. Now, all of us who like conspiracy theories, can we all do this? Just do this back and forth. Okay, these are the stupid people in the room, okay? Seriously. Do you know how hard? You think you know of a successful conspiracy? Look, some people get away with conspiracies, but successful conspiracies, you don't know about them. If you know about a conspiracy, it wasn't successful by definition. So if you think you know of a successful, you're crazy. Now, I'm going to teach you how to conspire. How many of you here are teenagers or younger? Raise your hands. Teenagers or younger. How many are here with siblings? Raise your hand. Oh, excellent. Are the three of you siblings? In the second and the third row, right here? You three are siblings, right? The three girls right here? Okay, good. Are your parents here? Oh, really? That's mom right there? Oh, this is awesome. That's dad over there? This is even better. I'm going to teach you how to conspire to lie to your parents right now. Okay? So just pay attention. I'm going to teach you how to lie. Because it turns out that conspiracies require certain things, and you know this working conspiracies, because this is how we deconstruct conspiracies, take people to jail. So it turns out you need 5 things to lie to your parents well. 5 things. Here they are. The first thing you need is the smallest number of co-conspirators. So there are 3 of you. Don't all 3 of you lie to your parents. Just 2 of you do it. 2 is the smallest number you can have. It's easier for 2 people to tell a lie than it is for 20. That makes sense? This is not rocket science, okay? Second, you need to hold it for the smallest possible period of time. Smallest possible period of time. So here's what you do. 2 of you decide to lie to your parents. As soon as you commit the lie, as soon as you do it, one has to kill the other. Seriously. Because then the conspiracy is over, right? It was only 2 people, and now it's over. If you don't want to kill your sibling, try this third thing. Third thing is you have to have excellent communication between the 2 of you. So at some point, your dad's going to jam you up, or your mom's going to say, hey, what's the deal with that? And you're going to give them a story. Well, your sister better know exactly what you told your mom. And if she's smart, she's going to ask all kinds of itty-bitty details that you haven't thought about. You better be able to call your sister and go, hey, this is what I told mom this. Okay? Excellent communication. Fourth thing. It's really about the strongest possible familial relationship you can have with your co-conspirator. So look, I get this. I have 6 brothers and sisters, all right? There's a couple I'm really close with. The other 4 I really don't like, okay? I'm just going to be honest, all right? So the 3 of you, there's a couple of you who will like each other, and there's always one like, I don't really like her. Don't include her in the conspiracy, okay? Because she will rat you out, okay? So you have to make sure you do it with somebody you're close to. Last thing, if you can avoid pressure, if you can avoid having your parents ask any question at all, well, you can get away with it. Just avoid pressure. Now, it turns out these are the 5 things that lead to successful conspiracies. I get to give you story after story of how we've broken conspiracies, just deconstructing these. But if you're suggesting that the Christian story is also a conspiracy, it has to have these 5 things. That's the problem. It's not just, James and Peter and John who are saying this about Jesus. It's not just the 12. In Acts 1, it says the upper room has 120 people trying to pick a replacement for Judas. They picked Matthias, somebody who had seen Jesus from the baptism to the resurrection. How large is this conspiracy? Paul says in Acts 15, one of the earliest creeds in the church, he repeats what became a creed in the early church in Acts 15, verses 3 to 8. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried and was raised according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brethren at one time. Most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. Do you realize there were 500 people that the Corinthian church could have asked questions because Paul says they saw the risen Christ on the same day? How big is the conspiracy? It's too big. If all you told me was, I think it's a conspiracy involving 500 people, I'm like, are you crazy? 500 people, give me a break. Who keeps 500 people quiet? That's never going to happen. Let's play again Clue together. This is old school Clue. Remember this board? This is the original Clue board. Sorry, guys. We're going to change the board, make it this area around where Jesus did his ministry. The game pieces will simply be the apostles, okay? So here's the first issue in this game of Clue. We've got too many dang people. But maybe they're only holding it for a short time. That would make it reasonable. How long are they holding it? 6 minutes? 6 hours? 6 days? 6 weeks? 6 months? 6 years? No, 6 decades. You want me to believe that 500 plus people kept this quiet for 6 decades? All right. Did they have excellent communication? They would need that. Actually, they're not in this holy huddle. They're all over the game board. So how is it that Thomas in India, who I'm sure is being tortured at this time, and they're snapping off his fingers and saying, hey, dude, tell us the truth, because Matthew in North Africa, he's already told us the truth. Whether he had or not, it doesn't matter. Just lie to this guy. You know, Paul's drinking margaritas over here, okay? So it's time for you to tell us the truth. Separated by thousands of miles. They can't Snapchat each other, folks. They can't text each other. How do they talk to each other? How do they know what the others are saying? Now, if you're just both repeating what you saw with your own eyes, it sounds the same. But how would you otherwise know what the other guy is saying? And you played Clue. Are they under any pressure? You've had those game pieces, right? You ever watched Jack Bauer in 24? You know what I'm talking about, Jack Bauer? It's an older show now. But Jack Bauer would do whatever it took to get a confession. If I need to cut your fingers off, I'll just do that until you tell me the truth. That's what he would do. That's what was happening to these guys. How these guys were martyred was not fun. Quartered, boiled, tarred, terrible. Now, are there brothers in here? Yeah. There are some brothers. If you recognize those two brothers, you are really old, okay? Who are those two brothers? Oh, there's no old people in the room. This is good. But let's take a look at what we have here. We have a couple of brothers, Andrew and Peter, John and James. But this guy over here, he is nobody. This dude down here, I'm telling you, this guy was not even part of the discipleship of John the Baptist. He wasn't part of those friends who were hanging out with John the Baptist, and then John sees Jesus, and all these guys go to Jesus. He's not part of that group. As a matter of fact, he's the last guy in. His name is Matthew. His name was Levi. He was a tax collector. He's not looking for the Messiah, and oh, there he is. There's the Messiah, and so everyone goes. That's not who this guy is. He's collecting taxes when Jesus taps him on the shoulder. He doesn't know any of these guys. The first guy I expect to roll is Matthew, yet Matthew never changes his story. He writes one of the very earliest Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew. I just think this is, and with all the pressure, this is too easy to break this. None of these folks ever changed their story. So is this possible that they're lying? Yeah, of course it's possible. Anything is possible. It's just not reasonable. Maybe they imagined it. You know, they thought they wanted Jesus to be alive. They didn't want to see him die. And so sure enough, they wanted it so bad. Some of them were by themselves when they first saw Jesus. You know, for example, Mary is at the garden. She sees what she thinks is the gardener, and then, oh no, it's Jesus. No, Mary, it's the gardener. You just want it to be Jesus because you want him to be alive, and you're by yourself. Oh, maybe it's someone like Peter. At least in this account, in Luke and in 1 Corinthians, he appears to be by himself when he sees Jesus. He wanted Jesus to be alive. He could be mistaken. He could have hallucinated. He wanted it so bad. Even James probably felt bad about how he treated Jesus, so he could have by himself seen something that wasn't true because he wants it so badly. But what do you do with someone like Paul, who on the road to Damascus sees the risen Christ? Do you think that Paul wants Jesus to be alive? I don't think so. I'm not sure you can explain Paul this way. How do you explain when more than one person sees the same thing and repeats it for years later? Like the people on the road to Emmaus. Are you telling me they're having a group dream? There are no such thing as group dreams. Like if I told you I had a dream last night and I'm driving a convertible down Mulholland Drive and you told me, yeah, it's a red Tesla. How do you know my car in my dream? That would freak me out, right? Because we don't have group dreams. Yet these people report, they having a group dream here? And it gets worse, right? Because it's not just these two. There are the 3 Marys at the tomb. These 3 report the same thing. There are 7 people at the sea, 7 disciples of Jesus who see the same thing at the same time. I couldn't even get them all on the same screen. So I got 5 of them on there, okay? The other 2 are over there. Then you have the disciples in the upper room. No Judas, no Thomas. We have 10. 10 who see the risen Christ at the same time. How do we explain that? Then Thomas comes back in the mix and says, I have 11. Several times we have at least 11 because we have Thomas with them. This is problematic for this theory. Remember the mountaintop? How many are here? Well, look, we know the disciples. That could be just the 11, but it could also be the entire mass of disciples. There were 72, remember, at one time he dispatched. We have no idea how large this group is. This is my favorite scene right here. It's when Jesus ascends into heaven. Now listen to me for a second. Even if the resurrection did not occur, if all that happened was Jesus lives his life, and then at 33 years of age, he says, okay, guys, it's all on you now, and he ascends into heaven in front of his disciples, wouldn't that be enough for you to go, oh, this dude's different? Wouldn't that be enough? I mean, if there was no resurrection, but we still had the ascension, wouldn't that convince you? I suspect that most people who are skeptics, even in this room, if your spouse has been dragging you to church, I suspect if you saw Jesus ascend into heaven, you would become a believer that same day. So as a gift to you, I'm going to show you it right now. Do you want to see Jesus ascend into heaven? Do you want to see it right now? Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Whoop, there he goes. There should be no unbelievers in the room now, okay? You've seen the ascension of Jesus. And there are 11 people at least who saw that. Then you have Paul saying in 1 Corinthians that there were 500 people who saw the risen Christ on the same day. That's a lot of people, folks. How do we explain these kinds of things? I couldn't even get them all, so I'll go ahead. Oh, there you go. Got them all. Now, by the way, if this is just a hallucination, if I'm just imagining the risen Christ, there's a way to falsify this claim, right? Because if you think you're just imagining the risen Christ, just run back to the tomb, because I'm only imagining this. There'll be a body in the tomb. But we have an empty tomb. So now we're kind of rolling back to conspiracy theory, right? Because somebody's got to remove the body and to tell the lie. So I think this is easy to debunk. And this is why Peter says, hey, we're not making this stuff up, guys. This is not some clever story. We just happen to see it with our own eyes. So is it possible they're delusional? Sure. It's just not reasonable. Hey, maybe they were fooled by an imposter. Somebody who stood in for the Jesus, either resurrected the side or beforehand. Do you know who this guy is? Do you recognize him? Very famous con artist. His name is Charles Ponzi. Ponzi schemes have been given the name because of Charles Ponzi. He's a con artist. Now, I've learned a lot about, we have a lot of forgery and fraud guys who join our homicide team, and they'll teach you something about how to successfully get away with a con. You need 2 things to get away with a con. Number 1, you have to have the confidence of the people you are lying to. That's why they call them con men, because you have the confidence. So you have to be somebody who you would trust. 2, you have to know more about the con than the person you're conning. This is why these Ponzi schemes work, because the people who invest don't know enough about business to know that can't be true. So that means if we're suspecting that somebody conned the disciples, they'd have to have their confidence and know more about Jesus, or at least as much about Jesus, as they know, so they can repeat the words of Jesus to the people they're trying to con. That means we're looking for somebody who's part of the inner circle. And the problem I have is we still have an empty body, an empty tomb. I think we end up back in conspiracy theory, because who steals the body to make the tomb? It's a bigger group. In other words, it's not going to be just one guy conning. It's going to be a group of people who are put the scheme in place. But here's the problem I have with it more than anything else. You realize that the Christ that's described after the resurrection is every bit as supernatural as the Jesus who appears before the resurrection. In other words, the con artist has to be able to do these things. He has to be able to appear miraculous, because Jesus did that. Has to be able to work miracles, because Jesus still did that after the resurrection. Has to be able to do that pulley thing on the rope where he ascends into heaven. How do you do that? That's the problem. Is it possible? Sure. But it's just not reasonable, given that miracle worker after the resurrection is every bit as powerful as Jesus. Maybe they were just influenced by one guy who thinks he saw something and then convinces the rest. This is Barth's latest theory on the resurrection. He wrote a whole book on this, where he argues that somebody who had influence imagines the risen Christ. Only one person has to see it. Then they convince the others that they saw it too. That to me is the weakest theory of all, because who is this guy going to be? Remember, the first person to see Jesus isn't a guy at all, it's Mary. You think Mary had influence? No, Mary had no influence. She runs and tells Peter and everybody, hey, I saw the risen Christ. They're like, get out of the way. They run to the tomb. They want to see it themselves. They can't believe Mary. Is it Peter? Well, okay, so Peter says, hey, guys, I saw the risen Christ. Hey, and Mary, you saw him before I did. How's that going to work? She's the first observer. How do you convince somebody that they actually saw the risen Christ before you did? I don't care how influential you are. Who is it in this group that has this kind of influence that could convince the others? Let me tell you why this thing falls down. This happens in every conspiracy we work. You get somebody who's got a lie, he's convinced other people to tell you. Well, if I interview the guy who starts the lie, this guy, some disciple of Jesus, and I ask him for details about the lie, well, his details are crystal clear. Why? Because he is the inventor of the lie. But then I separate him from the others, and I ask the others to tell me what you saw. And guess what? Their descriptions are never clear. Why? Because they didn't think this up, and they're not able to. So this is the problem you have. We have a number of accounts, all of which are from different regions, different sources, just as clear. I think it's more reasonable to believe these are all lies than to believe this is the influence of one person on several people. And by the way, again, if you thought, well, he's mistaken, and he thought he saw the risen Christ, what are you going to do? You're going to go back and look at the tomb. Because if you're mistaken, there should be a body in the tomb. Yet the tomb is empty. This doesn't work. It's possible. It's just not reasonable. Last atheist theory. Ready? Maybe these are just late legends. Jesus was a guy, but the risen Christ thing, that's part of the late legend of Jesus. Now, we've already talked about this. We talked about this earlier today in the first talk. In order to be a late legend, let me tell you what you have to be. You have to be both late and a legend. Not hard, but the problem is it's not late. We've already described that. And we know it didn't change over time. It's not legendary. I mean, that's why we did a chain of custody. So this to me is not even possible. It's not late and it's not legendary. You got to describe it some other way. Here's the last way it could be described. Maybe it's just an accurate record of the resurrection, of what really happened. Just an accurate record. By the way, this would explain all of those 4 pieces of evidence most thoroughly. But I'm going to tell you something. Every explanation you offer for any set of evidences has strengths and weaknesses. Even when I've done a case in front of a jury, I know my case has strengths and weaknesses. Every case has strengths and weaknesses. Even the true case has strengths and weaknesses. You realize that your explanation, that they're just reporting this correctly and accurately, it has weaknesses. There was a weakness that I thought was a deal killer. I'm going to share it with you. This is the strength. Yes, it does accurately cover all that stuff. But here's the weakness. It requires a resurrection. It requires a supernatural act. You want me to believe that the most reasonable inference from evidence involves a miracle? I'm out. That's crazy. I was a very committed philosophical naturalist. There's no way I would believe in a miracle. But wait a minute, isn't that the thing that we're examining, though? I mean, the question we're examining in this session is this question. Are supernatural events like a resurrection ever the most reasonable inference from evidence? Oh, no, it can't be because I don't believe in supernatural events. No, stupid. That's what we're investigating. I get it. Right now you're thinking no, but you have to take your doubt and stick it on a shelf for a minute so we can investigate the case. You can't start off thinking you know the answer to this, because if you do, I will show you some piece of evidence. You will find a way to jump over that piece of evidence. I can show you how early these come. I don't care. I don't believe in supernatural events. I can show you how they're supported by early quotes of the church. I don't care. I don't believe in supernatural events. Well, I can show you how they're supported and corroborated by archaeology or internal evidence or external evidence. I don't care. I don't believe in supernatural events. You will find a way to jump over every piece of evidence I give you because you're committed to this end. And do you know why you're committed to that end? Because that's where you started and you refuse to move. That form of investigation never gets you an answer. It's circular. There's a reason why I showed you this nightstand. These people thought they knew the answer before they even bothered to pull up the blanket. If you think you know the answer before you start, good luck with that. Doesn't work that way. Same thing here. Look, when it comes to the resurrection, only one of two things happened. That's it. One of two things happened. Either he rose from the grave or he didn't. That's it. There are no other options. Now, if you want me to keep all explanations in view, including supernatural ones, because that's what will be required for me to get over there, I said, nope, can't do that because I don't believe in supernatural things. But when I examined all the naturalistic explanations, none of these work. You can try to make them work. Why do you think Bart's got a new theory? He knows these don't work. Let's find something new. Because these don't work to explain what we got going here. And by the way, I didn't care. I'd find a way to jump over these or go dig under these or go around these because I was determined to get to this answer. Now just take a look for a second. Of these two pathways, which is clearly less encumbered? It's obvious, right? There's only one obstacle on that side. And guess what? I'm the one who put it there. There doesn't need to be an obstacle there. I can't control this mess on this side. I didn't make those. No, those are there those are on their own. But that obstacle on that side is only there because I have a bias against the supernatural. I could clearly take it down. And so I'm open to possibilities. This is why last night we talked about, can you explain the nature of the universe by staying in the room? Once I realized you can't stay in the room and explain the universe, why am I holding up a blockade here? I already know there's something outside of space, time, and matter that acts in the universe. Why am I holding up this obstacle? I could easily take it down. And if I do, then guess what? This is by far the most reasonable inference from evidence. At some point, I realized that the only thing standing between me and the reasonable inference of the resurrection was me. And for some of you in this room, that's the only thing that's been standing between you and Christianity. Not that there's not enough reason to believe it's true, because there is. You don't want it to be true. I often will ask, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Now, on the college campuses, you ask that question, people will say, well, it's not true. I said, it's a thought experiment. Go with me on it for a second. If Christianity is true, would you become a Christian? No. Really? Then it's not about whether it's true or not. It's not a head issue. It's something else. Take a 10-minute break. When we come back, I want to teach you how to share truth with the people in your world. 10-minute break, and we'll come right back here. Okay. All right. Well, we're almost all back in the room. Have a seat. We're going to hop right back in so we can be respectful of your time today. I want to just take about 35 minutes or so to talk to you about how to communicate what we've learned this weekend. And we're going to talk about it from the perspective, of course, like everything else I do, from what first responders learn. Now, I thought about this a long time, right? Because it turns out that there are a couple of verses in Scripture that almost seem to be at opposite polar ends. Here in Matthew 5, it says, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Wow, that idea is so countercultural, right? There's a sense in which Jesus tells us that we are to be in the world with our enemies, with the people who are not like us, maybe even the people who have ill regard for us, and we are to be in that world and love them in a certain way that seems almost like it's hard for us to do. At the same time, there's another part of Scripture that says we're not to love the world. 1 John, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So in here, we're really saying, okay, it's one thing to be in the world. Of course, it's another thing to be of the world. And we are called somehow to be in the world, but not of the world. Well, if you think about that, that's pretty much what all medical and fire and law enforcement first responders are constantly doing. There's a sense in which we have to be out there in the worst neighborhoods doing in the world, but at the same time, we are different. We're separated in the kind of training we get. We're separated in the uniforms that we wear. We're in the world, but we're not supposed to get messy in there. We're supposed to be available to help people in the world, but don't become of the world. You don't want a police officer who eventually starts doing the things that bad guys do. It's one thing to be in the world, but another thing to be of the world. I wrote about this in a book called Forensic Faith, which is why I called this the Forensic Faith Conference. And I talk about 4 things that first responders do that if we did these as a church, we would change our world. All we're going to talk about today is this last one, because we've been talking about some of the other things, and I just want to talk about how to communicate what you just learned. A lot of what I've learned as a communicator has been working with one other guy who has become my best friend in terms of professionally. His name is John Lewin. And if you look at all of our Dateline cases, and I think I told you last night, we've been on Dateline as a pair more than any other team. And if you look at our Dateline cases, you'll see that John's always there with me. And John started his career about when I started mine. I think I might have been his second homicide trial. I think he was my second homicide trial. And we've been together. I'd never worked another homicide trial without John. And we just managed to finagle the system, right, to make sure we were always together. It was not always easy, but it was sure worthwhile. And I will tell you something he tells juries as he's getting ready to dispatch them to actually deliberate on a case. He says almost the same way every time he says it. So I've started to write it down, and I also want to share it with you. He always says it this way: when Detective Wallace brings me a case, he has the difficult task of releasing it to me for the trial. All the effort he spent investigating and preparing the case for filing is complete. Now he has to hand the case over to me for the jury trial. I know it's difficult for him. It's hard for him to trust me with his hard work. In fact, I bet he still thinks he could have presented the case better than I did. And I do believe that I could have presented the case better than he did. But he also believes he could have investigated it better than I did. And that's where the relationship is always so fruitful, right? He really wants to be a detective. And I really would like to present this in front of a jury because I don't trust him with it. But then what he says is he says, now I have to do exactly what Jim did with me. I have to hand all of my hard work over to you. And you have to make a decision. Jim was done when he handed it to me. I'm now done when I hand it to you. And I realized, wow, that's a big, I get it. I know it's as hard for John to release to the jury as it was for me to release to John. People ask us all the time, how do you win these cases? Where is it that you have all this success? Like, what part of the process is it? When you're in court, is it at the opening statement? No. Now, our opening statements are long. And we do a lot of media, and it might take 2.5 hours to do an opening statement. We always believe if you start by, basically, if when we're done with our opening statement, the jury's like, this dude is guilty. All we have to do now at that point is make good on our promises. We promised you something, we're going to make good on that. You're already convinced if we make good on our promises, he's guilty. So all we have to do now is make good on our promises. But this is not where we win our cases. And it's not in that period of time in which we're doing an evidence show. That 6 weeks where we're presenting evidence to the jury. It's not in the closing argument. And it's not in jury deliberation. It turns out that your success in communicating to a jury begins and is solely dependent on jury selection. Sad but true. You pick the wrong people to put in that box, ain't nothing good gonna happen. You got to do this first before you get the verdict you want. Does that make sense? How many of you have served on a jury? Raise your hand. Well, the first thing I talk about when I talk about communicating truth is this. It's about picking the right jury. If you don't pick the right jury, I don't care what you say or do, it's going to fall on deaf ears. And in our case, we just need one person to hang it. We got to get it right 12 times. Even though we start with a much larger group. So what am I looking for in jurors? I'm not looking for PhDs. I won't even put a PhD on. I'm not looking for necessarily like super smart. Got to be a PhD educated. No. I'm looking for passion first and foremost. Do you care? Apathetic people are very difficult to convince of anything. They don't care. Now, people will say they don't care to get out of jury duty, but I know they're just saying that to get out of jury duty. They're still passionate. They're just like hoping to avoid this, right? But once you get them on the jury, they're good to go. So I'm looking for people who are passionate. That's the first thing, passionate people. Number 2, I'm looking for people who don't possess a bias. We just got done talking about why bias can kill you. Your presuppositions will determine everything. Now, everyone's got an opinion. I'm not looking for, you might even say they are biased in some way. The question is, can you suspend your beliefs long enough to be fair in this jury? We're looking for that. Third thing, this is the last thing really, I'm looking for people who are humble, people who are prideful. That's why I don't put PhDs on, especially if I'm going to call a PhD in a certain discipline to make the case. I'm not going to put a PhD in that discipline on my jury. That dude thinks he knows the truth. That dude thinks that he's the best expert in the room. Really? I can't have you on my jury. You're not humble enough. I'm looking for these three things. We start off with a big room. You all come in. We're 70 plus deep. We're going to pick 12 people for the box, 4 alternates, because these are homicide trials. So we're going to have 16 people we're going to pick out of these 70 plus people. We have to question you to see if you fit in those 3 categories, because we only can put in 16 people. How do we do it? Well, we know when we start with that room of 70 plus people, there is a spectrum of belief in that room. You could actually divide the room into 2 large categories. Half the people, depending on where you are, it could be larger than half, but some of the people in that room are people who are really more supportive of prosecutors than they are of defense attorneys. They've had a good experience with the law. They've had a good experience with the prosecutors. They think if you walk in the room and you're wearing a jumpsuit like from county jail, you're probably guilty of something. Then there are people in that room who have had a bad experience with law enforcement, and they are more supportive of defense teams. They assume up front that if there's a cop involved, that dude's probably lying. Of these 2 groups, you can divide them in half again. So we have a spectrum. On the one extreme, we have people who are so supportive of the prosecution, they just assume if you got all the way to the point of filing a case against a guy and he is now in trial, that's because he's dead guilty. They assume that up front. Dude's guilty. That's why he's here. Otherwise, he's taking a deal. Number 2 are people who are pro-prosecution, but they're fair. If there's not enough evidence, they're not going to convict. They're at least have an open mind that's open to the possibility that they could be wrong. Number 3s are people who are pro-defense, but they're also open-minded. They will be fair, and they will convict if there's enough evidence. And then you have people who are so closed-minded to the prosecution that they just figure the prosecutors and cops are liars. This guy's been railroaded, and we have to do all we can to get him out of that, get him free. They're in group 4. By the way, no prosecutor wants a dude in group 4. No defense attorney wants a guy from group 1. So when we select juries, what we're doing is we're taking off the edges. We're trying to select out of the reasonable middle, which, by the way, is harder and harder to do in America. There is no reasonable middle. We are more and more polarized. But we have to find the middle ground, 2s and 3s. We put 2s and 3s on juries. Why am I telling you this? Because if you're going to share the gospel, if you're going to share whatever you learn here today, the entire world you're talking to is equally divided into 2 groups. You got people who are believers and people who aren't. We are now divided, polarized along these lines, even in our country. Of these 2 groups, you could divide them into half. So 1s are people who are so committed to their Christian worldview that if you did have the body of Jesus and drug it around town, they would say, I don't care. I don't even care if it's true. I just know it's always worked for us. Our family have always been Christians. I'm in. I don't care what the evidence says. I'm a committed believer. There are 2s, people who are Christians. They identify as Christians, but they have questions. They're like, some days, though, I'm like, I got a lot of doubts. Then there are 3s, people who are not believers, but they're like, I'm open. I mean, I kind of wonder sometimes if there's something more at play here than what I think is just space, time, and matter. Then you got people in the group 4 who are people who are like anti-theists. They're like, if there is a God, it wouldn't be your evil Yahweh. Now, what are we doing here when we're communicating the gospel? I call this the 3-quarter principle. Anytime I'm ever communicating the case for Christianity, I know that only 3 of these 4 people are paying attention. It's just the way it is. I know that 1, 2s, and 3s, they're listening to me. But 4s are not listening. Those are anti-Christians. Those are people who do not want it to be true. They're people who are dead set against you. So I have a strategy for all 4 groups. Simple strategy. Now you might ask yourself, why would you waste time with 1s? They're already committed believers. There are people in this room who would say, I don't really need the evidence. This has all been good. I'm glad you guys did it, but I don't need this stuff because I'm already a committed believer. Really? Do you have kids? Those kids are 2s. They're not 1s, they're 2s. Why? Because they're exposed to more doubt than you ever have because they have the glowing rectangle. This introduces doubt to Gen Z at a faster pace than any other generation has ever received doubt. If you're not paying attention to that, the attrition rate all across the country, we are decreasing by 1%. Christian identity in America is decreasing by 1% a year. And trust me, they're mostly Gen Z. They're young people. If you got a young person in your family, there's a very good chance that young person's a 2. And the person they want to get a question answered from is you, the one who thinks there's no reason to have any evidence. So when they have a question that requires evidence to get an answer, they turn to the one in their life who can't give them any evidence. Ones need to know the evidence. So I take my time with ones too, because you guys need to know it, even if you think you don't need to know it, because you got people in your life who need to know it. Of course, we love 2s and 3s. 2s and 3s are eager to hear the case. That's why we put 2s and 3s on a jury. Turns out that 1s are usually apathetic. Like, whatever, I don't need it. I don't put apathetic people on, I need passionate people. So I put 2s and 3s on. What do you do with 4s? My dad is a 4. I was a 4. What do you do with 4s? You could talk till you're blue in the face. Why am I not making any progress with this guy? Well, because he's a 4. What were you thinking? Do a little jury selection on this. If you know somebody's a 4, you have to do something different for 4s. You can talk until you're blue. They're not hearing you. So what do you do for 4s? You pray and you model for 4s. You pray, you ask God to work in the heart of 4s, because you know who changes the heart, who calls people first? It's not my stupid arguments. It's not my evidence presentation. It's God who calls people to us, so they now will listen to what before they would not listen to. God moves people from 4 to 3. I can't move them from 4 to 3 with my argument. I got to pray people into 3. And meanwhile, I can't be a jerk. So in that time right now where I am not able to communicate truth to my dad, I can build a relationship with my dad. And that's what I'm doing. I'm praying and modeling Christ for my dad. That's what you're going to do. And then what happens is, God moves you into a 3. He did that for me. If you'd have met me at 34, you'd have said, there's no way that dude's ever going to be a Christian. But by 35, I was in. Because God did something first. He moved me from 3 to 4. We take groups of high schoolers on trips that will stretch them. And we train them for 8 weeks before we take them. Typically, where we take them in this category for philosophy and atheism is we take them to the campus of UC Berkeley, because that's a very hostile campus. And we just spend time there evangelizing students and atheist professors. And it really stretches our kids. But we teach them jury selection first. So when they get on that campus, they can figure out, oh, this guy's a 3, this guy's a 2, this guy's a 4. And they know what to do with 4s. The first time we started training this, I had a group come back from Berkeley, and this was the shirt they designed for themselves. We'll pray for group 4. Now, what you got to do also is we don't just pick a jury and throw them in the box. We instruct the jury about the nature of evidence. These are called jury instructions. If you've ever served on a jury, you know we just don't say, okay, here you go have fun, figure it out. No, we give you a set of jury instructions that you take with you into your deliberations. If you don't instruct the jury you pick, half the stuff you're talking about won't go anywhere. Now, we talked about this. I'm not going to cover all of this, but we already talked about, for example, there are 2 different forms of evidence. What are they? Direct and indirect. You know how helpful that is? Because if you're going to get stuck in a conversation where someone's going to say, well, you have no hard evidence, and you can say, well, there is no such thing. No one's got hard evidence for anything, because it's not a category. There's only direct and indirect evidence. Then you realize, well, this is eyewitness testimony and everything else. Well, we've got both of those for the Christian worldview and for the evidence for God. We've got both of the forms of evidence we would use in criminal trials, because there's no such thing as hard evidence. Jury instructions help. We also talked about what's the standard. Is it beyond a possible doubt or beyond a reasonable doubt? People will say, well, you can't know with certainty. Well, what do you mean by certainty? You mean possible doubt? Yeah, no, duh. You don't know anything by possible doubt. We don't even be here right now. We could all be at home sleeping, dreaming about this right now. That's possible, but it's not reasonable. We could all be what some philosophers believe, we are in a computer simulation. This is an actual line of thought amongst philosophy professors. That's possible, but I don't think it's reasonable. You don't behave on possible doubt, you behave at reasonable doubt. Why would you hold Christian views to possible doubt? You think you're beyond a possible doubt on your view of cosmology and how the universe got here? You think the Big Bang cosmologists have no one who disagrees with them? No, there's like 8 different forms of cosmology. Give me a break. No one's beyond a possible doubt. Why would you want to hold us to that standard? Jury instructions help. We also talked about how you can have an open question, yet still render a verdict. We talked about that this morning. Good jury instruction. We give that jury instruction because judges tell juries to move, because I could always level an imaginary or possible doubt. So get beyond that, and you don't have to have every question answered to render a verdict. Those are helpful jury instructions, but let me give you one we haven't talked about yet, because those we already have. It's this one. We talked a little bit about how witnesses never agree, and that's okay, that's good. Oh, how many angels are at the tomb? How many angels are at the tomb? Is it 1 or is it 2? Depends on the gospel. How many women are at the tomb? 1, 2, 3, it depends on the gospel. So you can't trust these gospels. They're all these different numbers. All these different... Well, look, if there's 2 people there, that means there's also 1 person there, different than who I'm focused on. If I said to you, do you remember the Beatitudes? Blessed are the poor in spirit. If I asked you all to remember them for me right now, some would give me some would give me others. Together we could cobble back all 8. But you probably don't know all 8. You might know 3 of the 8, or 4 of the 8, or 5 of the 8. The fact that you only remember 5 does not mean there wasn't 8. Somebody else will fill in the gaps. This is what happens. And when you interview somebody, matters. Let me give you an example. I told you before, this is the only question I have. Are there officers on the scene? Have them separate the eyewitnesses. Why? Because you get to an event and you talk to the first eyewitness, and she's going to say something like this. He wore a white t-shirt and jeans, his hair was short, he yelled a lot. Okay. She's focused on 3 areas. 3 areas that she has decided to give me information on. So I talked to the next guy. He says, he wore a t-shirt and jeans, his hair was blonde, he demanded money. New information the first person did not give me. Is one of these guys lying? No. He is at least giving me the information in the same 3 categories. What did he wear? What did he look like? What did he say? Third person says, well, he wore a short sleeve shirt and jeans. He was white. That's new. He screamed at the clerk. Is he lying? It's different than the other 2. No, he's still providing me information in the same 3 areas. Meanwhile, you'll see standing off to the side, there's a guy who you didn't know was an eyewitness who has been overhearing the interviews. We want to separate eyewitnesses. We don't want them to know what the other people have said. But this guy, unbeknownst to you, is an eyewitness who's been waiting in the wings, and he's now heard what everybody said. And you're like, dang it, all right, come on over here, we'll talk about what you saw. So he comes over, having already known what everybody else said, and he says, well, he's a regular customer. Afterwards, he ran out to a white van. What? Remember what the other 3 talked about these things. But that's not what this guy's talking about. This guy's talking about stuff the other guys didn't even cover. Like, who is he and what did he do afterward? Why is this guy coming in and giving us all this new categories of information that they seem completely out of character to the first 3? Why? Because he knows what the first 3 said. So because you interviewed him last and he knows what the first 3 said, he fills in details that the first 3 didn't offer. This happens in every case I've ever worked. I have to stop them and say, okay, go back and just imagine for a second that I didn't know anything. Like, I didn't hear the first 3. Can you just start at the beginning for me and just offer it as though you have no idea that anyone has said anything? And then he'll go back and he'll start to mention the other 3 categories again. Why is this important to us? Because something similar happens in Scripture, right? You have an event, and then you have one of the witnesses who will tell you something. As they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me. He is addressing 2 issues. Mark is talking about where were they and what did Jesus say. Well, then the next one comes in. Oh, well, as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me. That's different. But still the same 2 areas. Then you get another witness that says, but behold, the hand of the one betraying me is with mine on the table. Kind of sounds the same, but it's a little slightly different presentation of that, but same two areas. So now we have Mark and Matthew and Luke who've given us their accounts. And then there's a dude hanging out in the wings here, I don't know if you can see him, who has heard everything the first three told you, and he comes in dead last, and he now offers his account. Here's what he says. He says, there was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. This is all new. So when he had dipped the morsel, he took it and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Really? This is great. But after the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, what you do, do quickly. Do you see what's happened here? He's not answering the same categories the other ones did. He's answering completely different categories. Why is he doing that? Just like our witness in the crime, he's the last guy to give the testimony, and he's giving it late after the other three have already testified. John is the latest gospel. He comes in dead last, and his gospel does more to fill in gaps than the other three. The other three are called synoptic gospels because they sound very similar. Then this dude comes along and everyone's like, oh, this can't be true because it's so different. Well, no, this is what you get with the fourth guy who's interviewed last. You're always going to get a different kind of interview. That, to me, is exactly what I would expect. A jury instruction will help your people to see that that's what you should expect. Here's one that's really troubling for some people. Do you realize a witness can be wrong, yet still be considered reliable? That's right. I had a case. It was another Dateline case in which a woman was killed at a Kentucky Fried Chicken. And when she was killed here, it was troubling because she had stepped in. This woman right here was supposed to work that night. But she wanted to date a guy, so she asked Robin to cover her shift. While Robin was covering her shift, Robin was murdered. For years, she thought that was supposed to be me. I'm the one who got Robin murdered. She carried that weight for a lot of years. She was interviewed afterwards and gave her story. When she got there that next morning, she was panicked. She had switched shifts with Robin, and Robin's car was still in the parking lot when she got there in the morning, and she knew right away, this is not good. Robin's car should not be here. She had a weird sense that something had happened to Robin. Up the back of her neck, she ran into the business, and she ran through this door. And then she walked into the kitchen where Robin was working, and Robin was dead on the floor. Years later, 35 years later, we went to trial. One of the key questions for this woman, whose name was Karen, tell me, was that door you walked through, was that locked or unlocked? Because it would tell us, did Robin open the door for somebody she knew? Did that person have a key? Just tell us, was that door locked or unlocked? And Karen took a pause. Now, we hadn't asked her that question before, and we didn't think it'd be an issue. But she paused, and she paused, and she paused, and she gave the wrong answer. She was wrong. She gave the absolute wrong answer. Now, of course, what the defense did in the his closing argument is he argued you cannot trust Karen on anything she gives us, because she was critical to us on what she saw in the crime scene. She was the first person in the crime scene. But he said you can't trust Karen for any of that, because clearly she was wrong about the doorknob, so therefore, how much of this is she wrong about? Well, it turns out the jury found that she was reliable. Why? Because a witness can be mistaken about something and still be considered reliable. We have a jury instruction for this in California. This is what it sounds like. Do not automatically reject testimony just because of inconsistencies or conflicts. Consider where the differences are important or not. People sometimes honestly forget things or make mistakes about what they remember. Also, two people may witness the same event yet see or hear it differently. I am not suggesting that the gospel authors have got anything wrong. I don't think they have. But even if they were wrong about a detail, you would not be able to say they're unreliable, not in a court of law. It's about why would she be mistaken about this. You know why she was mistaken about it? Because the minute she got to the parking lot and she saw that car, she thought something's wrong with Robin, something's wrong with Robin. She ran from the car to the crime scene, and she can't remember any steps she took between those two things. She can't remember what she touched, what she opened. She was already thinking about dead Robin. So I can explain why she was wrong about the door. And the jury was already over it. Here's one that drives me crazy. I want to share it with you as a jury instruction. There is a difference between a fact and an inference. Facts are about evidences. We present evidences to a jury trial. Then we ask them to render a verdict. The verdict is an inference from evidence. Now, I wish it was just about presenting, here are the rules of evidence. So you take these evidences we've given you, and now you're going to come to a conclusion, and you should all agree, because I've all showed you the same evidences, and I've shown you the same evidence rules. Doesn't work that way. It turns out there are other things that go into your decision-making process. How it is that you're wired, how it is that you're built, what your particular memories are, what your likes and dislikes are, your personal taste, what you're passionate about. These are the things that go into your decision-making process. So I can show two people the exact same set of facts and come to two very different conclusions. Not because the facts are messed up, because there's more going on in your decision-making process than just a reasonable examination of facts. You're wired a certain way. That's why some of us start in the same place, yet end up with very different conclusions. Why does this happen? Because of all that stuff we talked about that's in the middle. Now, why is this important? Because it turns out last night when we talked about the evidence for God, there is scientific evidence about the universe, about biology, about DNA, about cosmology, about neurology, about how your mind works. Some people look at all that evidence, all that biological evidence, and they say, I believe evolution is the best inference for this evidence. But last night, the case that we made uses the exact same evidence. I'm not looking at different evidences. I'm looking at the exact same evidences, and I think from those same evidences, the best inference is design. Why we separated here? It's actually not about the evidences. It's about all that other stuff. It's why do we want to believe? So I want to make sure that I'm not allowing this stuff to color my decision making. But for a lot of people, it is what the tail that wags the dog. One thing that drives me crazy is this expression, settled science. Have you ever heard this, settled science? Really? They'll say, yeah, evolution, for example, is settled science. Like we can't talk about it anymore. That issue's already been resolved. Really? Inferences are never settled. That's an inference. There's no fact of evolution. It may be true, but it's not a fact like an evidence. It's an inference from evidence. The question is it the proper inference from evidence? That's all it is. But to say that evolution is a fact mistakes the difference. There are settled sciences over here on the evidence side. In other words, I might get there and there's fingerprints. I can't argue about that. There's fingerprints and there's DNA in the scene. That's settled. But what you infer from those fingerprints and DNA is not settled. Inferences aren't settled. The evidences are settled. So yes, there's some evidence about biology. That's settled. But what you infer from that is not settled. That is an inference. So when someone tells me this is a fact and it's settled as science, I'm like, we don't know the difference between a fact and an inference. Next thing. All causal explanations require a burden of proof. How many times have you heard this said? Look, you guys believe in the invisible, spaghetti monster, the God of yours, okay? I don't believe in that thing. You're saying that something exists that I don't see, therefore the burden of evidence is on you because you're making the claim. Whoever makes the claim holds the burden of evidence. Well, I think that's true, but don't think for a second that we're the only ones who shoulder the burden of evidence as Christians. That's not how this works. Let me show you how this works. You get to a crime scene, right? So here's our crime scene, and there are several pieces of evidence in the crime scene. So I'm standing in front of this crime scene with my partner, and I say, I think a coworker did it. And my coworker, my partner says, no, I think that evidence shows that his girlfriend did it. Well, we're at odds here. No, I think it's a coworker. No, I think it's a girlfriend. Okay, well, I've got a burden of proof because I think this stuff best points to his coworker. He's got a burden of proof because he thinks this stuff best points to a girlfriend. We both have the same burden of proof. So let's flip this. And now we're looking at the universe. There are several attributes of the universe we talked about last night, right? The beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the origin of life in the universe, the appearance of design in the biology, mind, free agency, objective moral truths, evil. These are things that are in the universe. If you're an atheist, you have a different view than I do. As an atheist, I would have said, I think that natural causes can explain these pieces of evidence, space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. As a Christian now, I say, no, I think the best inference is a divine being. We both have a burden of proof here. I have a burden of proof. I think God is the best explanation for those 8 pieces. I'm happy to shoulder that burden of proof. But don't think for a second that I'm alone. You think you can get that with space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry. That burden of proof's on you. You also have a burden of proof. Let's make sure we ask for that when we talk to people. Really? So if it's not God, what's the alternative? Show me how the alternative works. That's reasonable. We're describing features of the universe. All right. I want to go to a Q&A, but before I get there, I want to show you one thing that I think keeps us from making the case for Christianity, is how do we gain our enthusiasm? One thing that people say about John is that he is so eager, he's so prepared. They'll say these words, oh, he's passionate, he's fearless. Doesn't that sound good when you're talking about a prosecutor? These are all LA Times. The LA Times describes him this way. Really? Okay, I know John. Okay, he's none of these things, all right? But you know what he is? John is incredibly, ridiculously prepared. And there is a relationship between preparation and enthusiasm. I want to show it to you. How many times when you were in college or you're in high school, and you walk in, and your teacher has got on the board, oh, there's going to be a test coming up. There's going to be a test next Friday. And you're like, oh, dang. All right, fine. And then on the day of the test, you walk into the classroom, and I kid you not, there is some dude in that classroom who is so excited that today is test day. You know that. There's been people like that in your life. You go to school that day, and there's some knucklehead who's like, oh, this is a good day. Why? Because we have a test today. Who does that? Why is he like this when the rest of us are kind of like that? Why? Well, I think you know why. This dude is studied up. This guy's ready. He's prepared. When you're prepared, you can't wait. Let's do this. I'm ready. This other person's not so prepared. That's the difference. If I said to you tomorrow, we're going to go downtown and we're going to spend time sharing the gospel with people in our community, people who know you personally, but they aren't believers, a lot of you would go, ugh, not so happy, not so eager to go. And you know why you're not eager to go? You're not prepared. Preparation translates into enthusiasm on test day and when you're witnessing to your friends. So I'm going to give you a couple of things you could say that can breach the board. I actually think the hardest part of evangelizing with strangers or anything else is the first 30 seconds. Once you get past the fear of the first 30 seconds, you're good to go. So I want to give you something you can just say thoughtlessly that'll get you past the first 30 seconds and initiate a conversation. I have a friend named James Borcardo. He wrote a book called Unsilenced. Here's what he does in any situation. I know it sounds awkward, but trust me, this always produces a gospel conversation. He'll go to a complete stranger and say, hey, good to meet you. What do you think happens when you die? He gets to that question right away. He knows that might be hard, but he says it so effortlessly because he says it all the time that this just comes out of his mouth. Well, then you're going to get several responses from people, and the responses you get from people are diagnostic. I think you go back in the dirt. That diagnoses your worldview for me, doesn't it? Oh, I think you go to heaven. There's still a lot of conversation to be had there because lots of people believe in heaven, but they're not Christians. I have another friend who's a little bit older. This guy's name is James. But I have another friend, his name is Grover. So that kind of tells you he's a little bit older. He's in Montana. And here's what he says. I think, is more clever. Because he'll look at you talking, standing next to him in the elevator, and he'll say, oh, I like your watch. That looks like it's well designed. You know, everything that's been designed has been designed for a purpose. What is yours? That's what he says. Now you're talking about design, right? So if this is a good question to ask, because if you think you are designed, so if all you did before you leave here today is in your mind, you create your own elevator speech, that thing you're going to say to get past the first nervous 30 seconds, that would be worth your time. Just do that. And now let me leave you with one last thing. You guys have been so good doing this with me. And let me just leave you with this. There's a lot more I could say, but I say it all in the book. And to be honest, I think we've probably flooded you, and it's time for some Q&A. But let me just say this to you. We make closing arguments all the time, and we try to be very persuasive in this. Have you guys owned, we talked about dogs last night, right? You know, I used to own a Chihuahua. In a dog yard, the noisiest pain in the butt dog in any kennel, in any dog yard, is the Chihuahua. You know that, right? Why is the Chihuahua so loud and so vicious? Because he knows that he's, for example, a Great Dane walks in this yard, ain't making any noise. Great Dane just walks in real calm, does his business, no big deal. Why? Because the Great Dane's the biggest dog in the yard, right? This guy's making a lot of noise because he knows he has to, because he feels like he's a Chihuahua. Do you realize sometimes as Christians we sound more like Chihuahuas than Great Danes? Why? The Christian worldview is the big dog in the world of worldviews. It makes sense of the world you're living in, and it can hold up to any criticism. It has for 2,000 years. It's reasonable. It's evidential. I want you to make the case with this kind of big dog confidence. And so here's my advice to you. Remember, when we make a case in a jury trial, it's not just one prosecutor who is alone in making the case. That prosecutor has a team, usually sitting at the table with us. I'm usually sitting at that table. We also have a bunch of paralegal folks who will come in and do a lot of the heavy lifting when we need errands run. We also have police officers of my agency who will help us to round up witnesses and do other things. We also have experts we will call to make the case. I don't know if you see this or not, but when you do a trial in front of a jury, it is a team sport, like a game of baseball. Everyone's got a role to play. Now, there are times when you're sharing what you believe with a friend or a family member and you feel like it's a game of tennis. I lobbed the ball over. I either hit it inbounds or out of bounds. It's all my fault. Who else can I blame? I hit the net. Oh, well, it's my fault. That is not what evangelism is. It's a game of baseball. There's a difference between these two sports. Look, when it comes right down to it, you might think in order to be successful, I have to walk out to home plate, swing as hard as I can to get a home run. That means someone's going to drop to their knees and accept Christ today in front of me. My dad. I can come home from every time I visit my dad feeling bad about the fact he's not accepted Christ yet. But that is not my goal, is to hit home runs. Because I don't know where people are standing on the base path. Maybe that person's been on first base for 5 years, but you said something today that moved them to second base, where they might sit for a year. Because this process, especially if I'm talking to Mormons, takes years to move them around the base path. Now, if they're on third base, you might be the guy who actually drives them in. But let me tell you why this is helpful for me. I don't get upset anymore when I don't get a home run. And I don't get too excited when I do. Because if someone comes to faith today, I realize that wasn't me. I had a small part in it. But other people moved that guy to third base, and I said something that God used to move him home. So I don't get too high or low. I realize my responsibility is not to swing for the fences every time and get home runs. I'll try, but if it doesn't happen, my point is I need to just get off the bench and make contact with the ball. So that's my encouragement for you. You may feel like you got someone in your life that you have been swinging and swinging and swinging and nothing's happening. Wrong. Something is happening. You just are only looking for someone to cross home plate. And you're probably moving that person around the base path. You're having success, you just don't see it. We have a tendency, cops do, to see the entire world divided between two categories: sheep and wolves. Now, there's another animal in the yard that protects sheep from wolves. That's a sheepdog. And sheepdogs are interesting because sheep don't like sheepdogs any more than they like wolves. They don't. They hate sheepdogs. They're both canines. They can't tell the difference half the time. And we're described in Scripture as what? Sheep. That is not a compliment. Sheep are stupid. They are dumb as a rock. They are. And they're dirty animals. And they don't even have any idea they're being picked off by wolves. They're just getting one less every day. They have no idea what's going on. They're not even that smart. Now, it turns out that almost all the ministries in America that are sheepdog ministries are either first responders or ex-military. Because those are the groups we see ourselves as the sheepdogs that protect sheep from wolves. I know this for sure. If there is a yard full of sheepdogs, we have no wolf problem. The problem is we have a yard full of sheep and no sheepdogs. And we have a wolf problem both in the church and in the culture. So my hope is over the last 5 sessions together, You have moved from sheep to sheepdog. And what kind of sheepdog matters? We were out running on a trail. We saw a sign, I kid you not, for a lost dog. It was a lost Chihuahua in this environment. Really? That ain't good. Now, if it's a lost Great Dane, no big deal. This thing will survive. But a lost Chihuahua, where do I even look for a lost Chihuahua? I'll tell you where you look for lost Chihuahuas. You look in coyote poop, okay? Because that's where they are. Great Danes, you go to the shelter. That's where they are. I want you to be sheepdogs, but I don't want you to be Chihuahuas. Now, that being said, let's take some questions. We have just about 17 minutes before 12 o'clock. The first question I'm going to offer, because it was given to me by a student named Alexandra, okay, and what she said was, she has been sharing Christ with, where's Alexandra right now? Raise your hand. Where are you? Okay, repeat what your experience was at the camp. Okay, good. So were you here last night, Alexandra? Were you here last night? Okay, so remember we talked about, okay, so what she's saying is she's been sharing Jesus with someone at camp, and they didn't want to accept Jesus because they didn't want to hurt someone's feelings. And there are so many different ways to view God, so many different ways to think about God, that if you adopt one of these as exclusive, you're probably going to hurt someone's feelings. Right? Now, if you think about the two ways you look at truth, right? Objective and subjective, is it a cookie or is it a cure? This kind of claim about God. If it's a cookie claim, it's just a matter of subjective opinion, then yes, you're going to hurt someone's opinion if you tell them, I don't like chocolate chip cookies. Sorry, I don't want your chocolate chip cookies. I don't like them. Really, they're not even a good dessert. The best dessert, the only real dessert, in my opinion, is caramel meringue pie. Okay? Well, now you've hurt someone's feelings. But if what you're really saying is, hey, wait a minute, I see that you're dying of something and I have the cure, then the only act of compassion and love you could ever offer is the cure. And the question is, I get it, you may not think this is the cure, but let me show you why this is the cure. I think the first conversation you're going to have with that person is about the nature of truth. Is this kind of claim about God a cookie or a cure? And that's why we started with that talk first. Because otherwise, the claims of Christianity seem exclusive and they seem offensive. And by the way, they are offensive. Jesus told us they were offensive. The gospel is offensive because it tells us that we have a problem. It's an us problem. The gospel solves. It's not like getting your best life now. It's about not getting what you deserve. That's offensive. Because a lot of my friends would say, I don't deserve that. I got a partner I worked with for years, 10 years. He used to say all the time, Jim, we're good people. We put bad people in jail. If there's a good God and a good heaven, we're going to be there. We're good people. I said, but I don't know if you realize this or not, but I worship a God who created everything from nothing. That means he has all the power. That means he has the power to eliminate moral imperfection. That means he's not a good God. He's not a morally good God. If that's all he was, we're in good shape. I'm morally good sometimes. We worship a morally perfect God because he can eliminate moral imperfection. Are you perfect? I got an imperfection problem that Jesus solves in a way that nobody else solves. And I'm with you. I sometimes don't like it. I wish I could just solve it and do whatever I want to do. But the truth is, I have to bend my knee to that claim. But it's a gift. It's a cure for what's killing me. Okay, let's ask more questions. Go.
Yeah, the big thing that I think is you talk to people, they're just, well, whatever, they're busy doing their lives and, I'm busy working and paying the rent. God is God, whatever.
Yeah, so he thinks apathy. I think you're absolutely right. The claim has been made that the biggest threat to theism is not atheism, it's apatheism. So when we take our students to our theological trips, I want them to learn theology. So as a youth pastor, I said, okay, theology sounds like blah, 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 wah, 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 wah. That's what it sounds like. So I knew I needed to make it real for our kids. So I said, let's just go ahead and let's just go and reach out to people who have completely heretical theological ideas, but they still believe in Jesus, heaven, hell, God the Father, salvation, all of these things. Let's go evangelize Mormons. So I took them to Salt Lake City. Activate that. And let me tell you something. When we go to Salt Lake City, those people are waiting for you. They're like, really? They see us as the lost people group. I mean, I don't have to go door to door. You're going to come to my house? This is awesome. Come on in. They want to talk to you. They see you as the lost people group. They are passionate Mormon believers. But when you go to UC Berkeley to take a trip for atheism, you don't discover there are passionate atheists, don't get me wrong. But the vast majority are just apathetic students who don't care. So what do you do with those people? So we wrote a book about this. It's called So the Next Generation Will Know. And I wrote a whole chapter on how you increase passion, how do you ignite passion in young people. I think that we as adults, old folks, we have been doing a lot of what? What is true? What is true about the Bible? I did a lot of what up here on the stage. But I didn't do just what. For young people, you have to give them, I think, 2 whys for every what to ignite passion. 2 whys for every what. So if you said, oh, the nature of God is triune. We believe in a triune God. God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, God the Son. These are not 3 separate gods. This is one being in 3 persons. Well, you can make that claim, and it's like, okay. The first why is, why do you think that's true? Give me some reason to believe that. Give me some reason. Now, granted, I have to make a case from Scripture for that, but I can also make a case just from natural revelation for that. Because remember, there's 2 ways that God reveals the truth to us. One is in Scripture, but one is Romans 1. It's the natural world around us. No one's got an excuse because everyone can see what God has done in creation. They should know there's a God. We have natural revelation and special revelation. So I want to make a case for my kids. Here's why this is true from special revelation of Scripture, and here's why this is true from the natural revelation you can't get away from. That's the first why. Why is it true? But to ignite passion, you have to have the second why. Okay, so this is true, and this is why you think it's true, but why should I care? That's the second why. I have to show young people that it turns out, you know why you had that feeling yesterday on Instagram? It goes back to the triune nature of God. You're created in his triune image, and you have a certain relationship issue that is described perfectly by the Christian worldview, and that's why it matters to you how many likes you get on that stupid post. That's why you're upset that you visit your friend's site and they have more likes than you. You are built as a relational creature. It turns out the Christian worldview can explain why you're experiencing certain things in your life. It's not just why is it true, it's why should it matter to you? I've worked in cases where the defense attorney is like, oh, my guy didn't do this. There's no way. I work cold case killers. They spent 30 years being excellent citizens. They just happened to kill someone 30 years ago. Since that time, they have been brilliant. They are doctors. They are engineers. One was a fire captain. Not a police officer. Fire. Okay. Hose dragger. My whole point is, he was not a cop. You can tell that cops and firemen were always like battling each other. But my point is, these are regular folks. I have a defense attorney. She's like, there's no way. There's no way this guy living this way could ever have done that. Doesn't hold a Christian worldview. From a Christian worldview, I realize, are you kidding me? That's called the enigma of man. Christian anthropology describes it perfectly. You are in the image of God, designed in the image of God, capable of great beauty, entirely rebellious like Adam. You are capable of great evil simultaneously. That's the Christian anthropology. So when I see a guy who looks really good, dude, that is as much a killer as I could be a killer. Any one of us is that cold case killer. We are all capable of doing that murder, but for the grace of God. That's a Christian worldview on human anthropology. This defense attorney doesn't hold that view. Thinks people are basically good. That's not our view. Now, if you hold the view that people are basically good, at some point you're going to get hurt. So our kids need to know, what do we believe, why do we believe it, and why does it matter to their daily lives? I think if we just did the 2 whys, this means every parent who's in this room, stop with just the whats. 2 whys for every what. You will see your conversations change. Because now you're suddenly going, well, I'm not even sure why that's true. Now you got to do some homework so you can be ready to offer the why simultaneous to the what. That's what we tried to do in this conference, right? Give you whys. But the second why does it matter to me, I think is a game changer. And it requires us to be creative. Why should it matter? Why does any of this stuff matter? If we haven't thought about why it matters to us, we are not going to communicate that to our kids. I will tell you this. Apathy is top down. Apathetic organizations have apathetic CEOs. So when I see apathy in my own family, I'm like, that starts with me. There's lots of stuff I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about music. I'm passionate about sports. My kids know this. Am I as passionate about this as I am about those other things? And again, what do you love? What are you spending your time on? What are you spending your resources on? What are you spending your talents on? That's what you really love. Don't tell me what you love. Show me your calendar. I'll tell you what you love. I want my kids to see that I'm spending my lion's share of my time in this area because it's what I'm passionate about. So a lot of it for me has been top down, too wise for every what. And then it changes things. Another question. Go. Wait a minute. You're finding a lot of Californian. You're saying that in a sarcastic way. A California way of believing is coming your way. Like that's a bad thing? We're bad in California? There are Christians in California, you know. Not enough. Yeah, go ahead. So go ahead. Go ahead. So how do you mean that? What do you mean?
Well, a lot of the worldview, everyone's right, there is no wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And this, if you're a Christian, you're the villain. So what are some resources that you could suggest to help us combat that belief system in a Christian?
Okay, so she's talking about how this region, she feels, is becoming more Californian in the sense that people are more apathetic and also believe everything is, if everything is right. What I see is I see secularization. That's what's really happening. What's really happening is the country is becoming more secular. And that is true. Even when there's a pocket of growth in the Christian worldview, it's outnumbered by vast plains of secularization. And why would that be the case? Because we want to be our own gods. And we're looking for an alternative worldview that will allow us to just do what we want. If you can give me a way to start the universe, a way to answer the three questions that worldview answers. How did we get here? Why is it so messed up? And how do I fix it? That's what we're all looking to do with worldview. Okay, if I can get that, give me a way to shape my worldview that allows me to sleep with my girlfriend, please. And guess what? I will jettison Christianity and adopt that worldview. Just give me any lame answer to those three questions that allows me to do what I want to do morally. Do we not see this happening? So it turns out we have to be able to talk to our young people about why is this moral worldview, why is this the way that God has intended us to be? It's not because he's trying to limit us. If he's saying he wants to set us free, how does this moral worldview do that? I think young people want to see that. But as far as, I'm going to tell you right now, the wedge issue in America is the same wedge issue that's in Europe. They're about 35 years ahead of us. 35 years ago, Scotland and Ireland were largely religious. Now, in those two countries, more pagan officiate marriages and funerals than Christian. The entire country has flipped in 35 years. This is coming our way, folks. I'm okay with that. You know why? Because we have to be faithful even if it doesn't turn out the way you want it to be. There are faithful Christians in regions of the country where they are vastly outnumbered by pagans. Yet they are faithful. We've had it easy, so easy. We're like going, dang, this used to be an easy culture. I could kind of, it's not so easy anymore. We're complaining about that? Yeah, that's Christianity everywhere else in the world. If that's what it ends up being here, I'm going to be faithful in what you might think is a loss. Are you ready to be faithful in a loss? Would you rather be on that side but wrong or this side and right? I'd rather be over here and right. So I don't even care what's happening in terms of, I live in one of the more secular areas in California. As we get closer to the beaches, closer to the coastline, as you get closer to large cities, and as you get closer to university cities, we are more secularized. So if you're on the coast in a university town like Los Angeles, that's a secular environment. That's where I live. I'm very comfortable there. You're just going to have to be countercultural. Are you comfortable being countercultural? I am too. So bring it on. I'm okay with it. Go. Using the mic. Woohoo!
I was prepared for this from last night.
Okay.
So this question has been on my mind for a while. But thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
And thank you to Fellowship Leadership for bringing you here because this is important and it's been really good. I love your sheepdog analogy. That's really helpful. And thinking about the tools of the wolf, Galatians 5:20 says the acts of the sinful nature are obvious and leads with sexual immorality, which
Right.
seems to be a wedge issue right now. And it also goes on to talk about witchcraft, which from my understanding translates to sorcery, which is based in the word pharmakia or pharmacy, and your example of the case that you had with drugs. How have you seen that affect cases that you've worked, and how do you see that as a tool of Satan to take our minds away from the mind of Christ that we're meant to have?
Okay, a couple of things. And this will be my last, because I want to get you out of here at 12 o'clock. This will be the last thing we talk about. And if you have any other questions, remember, I honestly do answer, you can ask Susie, I answer questions every morning on the app. Anyone who asks a question, that's where you can reach me to answer a question. And I always make sure I answer them every morning. So I'll tell you what, I think if it wasn't narcotics, though, if you thought, well, narcotics are the issue. I'm not somebody who's, like, I got a doctor who's a anesthesiologist in my family, my son. So, and this is somebody who's a biochemist. There are ways that God has given us resources that I believe we can use for good. But we can also use the same resources. Like he's in pain meds sometimes. He's dealing with either neural blocks or he's dealing with pain meds with people who are in pain. And you can abuse those things. Clearly. But guess what? If they weren't there, you'd be abusing alcohol. I mean, you can take anything designed for good. You'd find some way to abuse it. We can abuse food, sugar, you name it. We can find a way to abuse it. Why? Because it's in our nature. We are fallen people, and we are fallen in those three ways, right? Sex, money, power. I want to control what I get to eat. That's a power issue. I want to live the way I want to live. Well, we'll find something to abuse. I'm more libertarian in this sense that I don't think we take, I'm not a libertarian when it comes to drugs. Don't get me wrong, I'm a cop. But I think that honestly, even if we outlawed all drugs and we were able to not even produce them, people would find some way to combine other things to get the same effect. Because we are driven toward our own hedonism. It's just the nature of who we are as humans. We're driven in that way. Now, what Christ asks us to do is to bend our knee, to submit all of our desires to Him. Wow, do you really think that those things you found satisfying that weren't Jesus could really be satisfied by Jesus? Is that even possible? That's the promise. And those who actually have learned to submit those things to Christ have found the promise to be true. But a lot of us, we're like, yeah, I'll give you a little piece, but I won't give it all to you. Then I'm like, hey, it's not working. Well, yeah, you won't give it all to Him. You just want to give a little piece, like a show, so your friends will think you're doing it. No, we got to give it all, and then you'll see the promise is true. That's how people who are drug addicted get liberated by the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's it. It happens all the time. That's why 12-step programs are rooted in a notion that there is a divine being. They don't even care what divine being you pick. They know you can't get there any other way. Well, it turns out those are okay, but there's a thing out there, a Celebrate Recovery program, where they put Jesus Christ back in the paradigm for 12-step programs, and guess what? Those are wildly successful, because it turns out just any God won't do. It's the God that was first in the 12-step program. That's the God that does. So I just think in the end, it doesn't matter what it is, we would find a way to corrupt it for our own selfish gain. Yeah, we do corrupt it, and it's always driven by hedonism, which also drives our sexual lust, our greed, our financial greed, our pursuit of power is all driven, and it's in 1 John, the lust of the eyes, pride. These are things that are, I discovered those three things working homicides, but they were in Scripture for years prior. For 2,000 years, they were in Scripture. I just didn't know it. Isn't it nice to know that your Bible describes the world the way it really is? Let's pray and let's go to lunch. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to lunch with you because it's too big a group. Let's pray. Father, we love you. We know we are blessed to be part of a community here that puts you first, that says, no, it's not enough just to sit in the pews. It's not enough to sit in the chairs. We have to actually do something because you aren't requiring this for our salvation. You just know that when we understand what you've done for us, we can't help but do for others. So help us to understand what you've done for us, and that this is true even if we have doubts on given days because you've given us enough evidence to know it's true. We pray that we be transformed by the evidence. And we pray this in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ. And everyone here says, amen. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.